I believe in the paranormal, but I will go out of my way to weigh out every logical explanation that I can possibly think of before assuming that something is paranormal. I've told myself that this is sleep paralysis to make myself feel better, but it was such an odd encounter. I was 14 at the time that this occurred. I'm now in my late 20s. And I was really into gothic stuff, witchcraft, spooky shit, etc. I had a friend who had a Ouija board and wanted to come spend the night and play with it. Of course, I jumped on the idea, so she came right over. As I predicted, absolutely nothing happened. Though at one point the piece did slide off of the board, but we ended up blaming each other. I'm still pretty sure it was her. After a while, as I said, we got bored, and we gave up and went to sleep. About a week later, I came home from school and felt tired, which was abnormal for me because I'd normally throw my backpack down and immediately go outside. But I decided that I would take a nap. No one was home except me. I went to bed and passed out immediately. I woke up and couldn't move, and panicked. I've never had sleep paralysis before, nor had I even heard of it. So needless to say, this was horrifying. I then levitated off of my bed and toward the middle of my room, where I began to rotate in a slow circle. I felt like I was screaming internally, yet no sound was coming out of me, and then I finally woke up. I bolted out of my room and stayed up for the rest of that day. My mom insisted that it was sleep paralysis, and reassured me that it happens to people sometimes, so I thought nothing of it, and moved on. About a month later, it happens again, at night this time. I floated toward the center of the room like before, and promptly from there was slammed against my upper walls and ceiling by some sort of force that I couldn't see. I could feel its hands on me though, and I could physically feel myself hitting the wall. I felt tingly as well, as if my soul might fly out of me. I don't know exactly how to describe this feeling. It was almost like I was vibrating, like when your foot falls asleep, but the needle jab numbness feeling doesn't feel quite painful. It was strange. I thought it was just sleep paralysis and reminded myself that I was dreaming to try and calm down, and started sort of willing myself to wake up, if that makes sense. I woke up, put on some music, and went back to sleep, and slept fine. The next morning I got up for school and was absolutely covered in bruises. It literally looked as though someone had beaten me with a baseball bat. So I told my mom, who said that I had probably just thrashed around in my sleep. This wouldn't be possible though, because I slept on a very soft, queen-size mattress, and I'm a small person. I even went around my bed to see if there's anything that I could have bumped into. There was nothing. She said maybe I had hit myself in my sleep, but there were bruises on my back and shoulders too, so it just didn't make sense. I tried to just brush it off, but by this point I was getting really paranoid. For the next few weeks I would have instances where I would start to fall asleep. My body would tingle like it did in the last experience, and I knew that if I let myself fall asleep that I would have the weird sleep paralysis again. So I would force myself awake and adjust my sleeping position and then try to fall asleep once more. I would do this repeatedly until I could finally drift off without this tingly sensation. This became a daily thing, but I was okay with that because I figured out how to basically avoid sleep paralysis and thought that the creepy dreams were over with. A couple of months go by with no incidents, and I had pretty much forgotten about it. By this point, it never really crossed my mind anymore, but I would still have the tingly feeling from time to time. It was Saturday. My mom was out with friends, my siblings were visiting family, and I was home alone. I kept feeling very strongly like I was being watched, but I told myself that I was just being paranoid, and that it was nothing. This is where it gets weird. I'm sitting on my bed, wide awake, writing in my journal. It's about 9 p.m. or so. The radio is on full blast, and all of a sudden I'm snatched off of my bed while wide awake by this invisible thing. I start screaming, and it starts slamming me into walls again. Finally, after a few minutes, it stops, and I float back to the center of the room, where I slowly start spinning in circles mid-air, much like the first experience. Only this time I can see myself lying on my bed on my back, with my legs crossed as they were when I was sitting there, hyperventilating with my eyes open while some sort of figure sits next to me. It looked like it would be extremely tall if it stood up. It was skinny with a masculine-looking build. Think tall and very skinny but muscular man. It had shoulder-length wavy hair, though it was really more of just like a shadowy outline of hair. Its body was made up of swirling black smoke only, and I don't know how to explain this any better. This smoke was darker than just being black. Like, imagine if the color black could be darker than it already is. That's what that color was. I have literally never seen a color this dark anywhere else. It was like seeing a color that no one has ever seen. The thing had big yellow almond-shaped eyes and a tiny black pupil in the middle of each one, but I couldn't discern any facial features. It didn't move. It just sat there staring at me for what felt like hours. Finally, I jump awake, and I'm laying in a pool of sweat. I immediately start crying and flipping out because, like I said before, I did not fall asleep. I was wide awake and sitting up when this happened. I wasn't even thinking about sleep. I wasn't even tired. My pen was still in my hand. My radio was still up loud, and my legs were still crossed. Maybe I fainted, but that's never happened to me before. Thankfully, we moved shortly after that, and it never happened again. But to this day, the hair on my arms stands up when I remember this thing. I've read a lot about sleep paralysis demons and experiences, and nothing seems to quite match what happened to me. I would like to share my recent experience. This is absolutely true and in no way fabricated. I have been shaken up immensely, and my perspective on reality has definitely changed. I live in India, and my family is Protestant Christian. My upbringing and the things taught to me in terms of faith have included an aspect of the supernatural and the spiritual. Though it was always told to me that demons and spirits of darkness exist, I was always a skeptic. I believed in proof, evidence, and logic. In my opinion, exorcisms were staged and everything about it was fake, until I had what seems to be my own personal experience with the demonic. This happened about a week ago. I was on my bed, playing a racing game on my phone at 2 a.m. The lights were off, and the only light was that of my phone. I usually put my AirPods on and keep my volume on full as I enjoyed the loud engine revving sounds of the game. I started feeling an ache in my back, and this made me think I was having another bout of kidney stone pain. It runs in my family. My way of coping with it is to just ignore it and move on with things. I've had multiple stones in my body, so I have learnt to manage the discomfort well by now. As I continued with the game, I started feeling breathless as the air was heavy. It came to a point where I thought something was definitely wrong. There was a dull pain in my stomach and head too. The sounds and music of the game I was playing became very muffled and scary. I managed to pull out my headphones and lie down. I laid out on the bed, on my back, looking up at the ceiling, wondering what was going on. My wife is working abroad for now, and I really wanted to ring her. I was not able to do that, however, because somehow logic and common sense had taken a back seat at that moment. I just wasn't able to think clearly. My palms and forehead were covered in sweat, and felt crushed, like under weight of something terribly heavy. I honestly thought I was about to die. My mom had visited me in March of this year and has not been able to since leave and head back to her own house due to the lockdown. So she was sleeping in the guest room and usually fast asleep at that hour. My mom is a very deep sleeper and rarely gets up for anything in the night. During all this madness that I was going through, she just woke up and came to my door and knocked. I heard the knocks and I wanted to say, "Please come in and help me," but my mind was too confused to do anything. She heard some groaning-like sounds coming from me and decided to let herself in. When I looked at her, I wanted to say help, but apparently I kept saying, "Just let me be. Let me die in peace." My mom told me this later. When she saw me in the state that I was, without any hesitation she touched my head and said, "In the name of Yeshua, I bind you, rebuke you, and cast you out." I felt the immediate sensation of wanting to puke. I rushed to the loo and did so. Instantly, I felt better, and my mind began working correctly. I could think straight and had no trouble breathing. The whole recovery didn't take more than a couple of minutes. While I know that this can be dismissed as a simple case of indigestion, or acidity, food poisoning, or even an anxiety attack, here are some reasons why it's got to be more. 1. The probability of my mom walking in that time was very low. Later, when I asked her why she came in at that hour, she simply said, "Because I felt like I should." Like a prompting in my spirit. 2. Why would I say things like, "Just let me die"? Any person in need of medical attention will cry for help rather than wanting to be left alone. 3. Why did I need to puke just after my mom said those words? 4. I had eaten dinner at 5 p.m. If it had something to do with that, why would it surface at 2 in the morning the next day? And 5. About a month before all this happened, I had a nightmare about an entity in my room. Something that looked like a black being with red eyes and teeth like a wolf, grinding its teeth at me or making low-pitched growls. I was scared after that, but I had dismissed it and moved on. I am really beginning to think that what I went through was a spiritual demonic oppression, which retreated due to the compulsion from a higher spiritual authority. I'm a sheriff's deputy in a fairly busy county. Along with this job comes the unfortunate familiarity with what a decomposing human body smells like. To me, it's very similar to an animal carcass, but with a much sweeter odor. Not sweet in the sense that I enjoy it. Hell no. That smell normally means a bad night for me and another gruesome memory to add to my catalog of things that I would rather forget. With that out of the way, I'll get to what happened. Last night I was patrolling a geographically isolated area of the county, which is very large and sparsely populated. Having completed the hour-long trek to the northwestern county line, I began driving through the mountains back toward civilization. About 25 miles from town, or the closest semblance thereof, I hit a straight stretch of highway through a wide valley. Since the weather was nice, I had my windows rolled down. As I passed the entrance of an old logging road, that familiar smell of sweet rot suddenly filled my car. Not just a whiff. A cloud of it filled the cab as if there was a week-old human corpse sitting in the front seat next to me. It was all too familiar, but this time there was something else that I couldn't quite place. It lingered for a few moments, then went out just as quickly as it had entered. Realizing what I had just smelled, my heart sank, and I pulled to the side of the road. I told myself that it was just a dead animal in the ditch, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned my car around and drove slowly back toward the logging road. The closer I got to it, the smell became stronger, and I grew more certain that I was indeed about to find a body. holding onto a shred of hope that I was wrong. I parked my unit on the side of the highway just before the dirt road. I radioed to dispatch, told them my location, and that I would be out of my unit for a moment. I didn't say why to avoid an awkward disregard on a possible body on the side of the road. I shined my flashlight into the ditch and into the encroaching briars and weeds as I walked closer to where I believed the source of the smell was. Once I was a few yards away from the dirt road, I saw the opening of a concrete culvert going under the highway. At this point, the smell was nearly as strong as it was when I had first passed. The opening of the culvert was about 3 feet in diameter, just large enough to hide a body inside. I cursed and held my breath as I leaned over and shined my light in there. It was just an empty tunnel stretching the width of the highway. Somewhat relieved, I stood and looked around. It smelled as if I was standing on top of whatever was emitting the odor. I searched around the brush for a moment, but found nothing. Thinking the origin might be on the opposite side of the highway, I crossed to the other ditch to continue searching. As I walked away from the other side of the road, the smell grew faint. I stopped at the opposite end of the culvert and peeked inside just to double check. The odor was nearly gone at this point. I stood up and checked my surroundings when I heard a crack in the bush behind me, and the smell engulfed me and was even stronger than before. Thinking for a moment that the wind must have shifted, I froze when I realized that the air was dead still. Whether it was fear or something else, a shiver went down my spine. In the distance, I saw headlights coming down the highway. As the car came near, the odor seemed to move away further into the bushes toward where I had heard the crack. The car stopped, and the passenger rolled down the window and asked if I was all right. I lied and told him that I was. I thanked him for checking and walked briskly back to my car as they drove away. Then I got the heck away from there. Once I was able to get cell service, I called my friend who was patrolling the opposite side of the county. I explained what had happened, trying not to let on that I was spooked. Once I was done, he paused for a moment, then asked about the unusual hint of something which accompanied the smell. He asked if it was sulfur, and I put 2 and 2 together. It was sulfur that I had smelled. I asked if he thought that I had found a demon in the middle of nowhere, to which he simply responded with a concerned yes. A little background on this guy. He is the son of a missionary and has been around the world. He has seen, rather smelled this before, and told me that it was a very concerning experience. This spooked me even more because his responses were very out of character for him. There's always the chance of a very scientific explanation, and I hope that one is out there. When I was younger, my parents had gotten divorced. My dad was an abusive alcoholic who drained my mom out of a lot of money, so my mom and I left at the time. My aunt offered to let us stay at her house until we got back on our feet. Now, my aunt lives in the countryside. It's miles of farmland and a few houses every now and then. Her neighborhood is small, but everyone keeps to themselves. The area my aunt lives in is called the Base. Apparently soldiers were housed there, and eventually died and were buried on that land. Don't know the exact history, though. Driving to her place at night is super creepy and confusing. You can easily get lost, so everyone aims to reach home before the sun sets. Now back to my story. My aunt had a second house, not too far away, where her family would go to do gardening and just chill out sometimes. My cousins and my aunt thought it would be a great idea to spend a night there. The house was an old, abandoned Baptist church converted to a house that my aunt had inherited. The previous owner was a seer woman and would do readings and even give exorcisms for people. My aunt took care of her when she was ill, therefore she gave the house to my aunt. The inside was run down, 1 couch for about 10 of us. Yeah, it was a big family. And a dirty bathroom with an annoying leaky pipe. Light barely entered the house during the day. It also gave an eerie vibe to it, because being in that house or on the land, it was always dead silent despite being surrounded by nature. That night, we all had these little rooms to sleep in, with there being so many of us that we had to share. My mom and I were in one room when I woke up to the sound of the wooden door being creaked open. I turned to see my mother upright, shaking and obviously full of fear. No one came through the door, but you could hear these loud, heavy footsteps around and inside the house. It woke everyone up, so we all huddled in the living room. All of a sudden, the lights cut off. We lit some lamps, and my uncle was getting ready to check on the noise outside when a loud banging came at the front door. It was around 1 a.m., and this place was completely deserted. We all stood still and quiet, and then the banging grew even more violent. The door began to shake, and a guttural, demonic voice was asking to be let in. Panic and terror struck all of us. My younger cousins began to scream and cry because the voice was unnatural, pure evil. The adults sent us into one room, and they formed a prayer circle in the middle of the living room. Everyone's backs were turned to the window, but I was the only one facing it, and I remember very clearly seeing a tall man with horns and a red aura looking back at me from outside. He was smiling at me, motioning me to come toward him. He had these long black fingernails that he began to scrape the window with. At this point, everyone could hear it, but by the time they turned to the window, he had vanished. However, all the doors started banging and the windows were rattling. We kids all ran out to the living room and joined the prayer circle, reciting the mantras for my religion, and then suddenly it stopped. The sun was now peeking in. It was 6 a.m. Everything felt like an hour, but we couldn't account for the rest of the time that had passed. We stayed for a few months in my aunt's original house without ever visiting that second house. My mom eventually got remarried, so we moved. It's been about 17 years or so since that incident, and we rarely visit my aunt, like maybe once or twice a year. Since then, however, the house has been demolished. My aunt has said that strange things occurred whenever she was on that land after that incident, and she felt like she was being watched. She couldn't handle it, and they eventually sold the land, too. When I was a kid, I lived in a little one-story house with my dad, my older sister, and my stepmom. It was a nice and quiet place. We had hardwood floors, and there was a hallway leading from the living room into where the bedrooms were. It was a rather dark hallway which turned to the left and led to a guest bedroom and my parents' bedroom. The reason it was dark was because there was just a single dim light on the ceiling between the two bathrooms and the second bedroom, which was at the end of the hallway before it turned left. There was also an attic door right above the master bedroom's door. We never really opened it. It's weird. It just didn't feel like we had permission to, even though we did and could use it any time. I can recall one day after school I returned home to the house being empty. My sister was at a friend's house and my parents went out to try and surprise us with McDonald's before we came back home. I remember calling out my sister's name to see if she was home as well as my mom and dad's name, and no one responded. I went into my parents' bedroom where they had a computer. I sat down and started to turn it on, hoping to get a few minutes of gaming in before my parents came back. As I sat there, the room felt like it was getting darker, but I told myself that my eyes were just adjusting to the computer monitor in front of me. The computer which was taking a rather long time to boot up. Back then, I was maybe 10 years old. I looked around the room to see if my eyes would adjust, but it was still extremely dark, even though the light was on, and it just seemed like they couldn't. It also started to feel colder and colder. And when I looked up again, the ceiling was completely black, and the darkness shrouded the light above me with a thick black haze. Immediately I looked back at the computer to compose myself and tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just a kid that was creeped out for no reason. As I focused on the monitor, the room was cold and quiet. And suddenly a woman's voice whispered shortly and sternly, my name. I could feel the wind on my ear and the pressure of someone holding my shoulder. I bolted out of the room, and moments later my dad came through the front door smiling and holding a kid's meal in his hand, asking me how my day at school went. I didn't tell him what had just happened. A little while passed, and my dad began having his own experiences in the house. Sometimes he would fall asleep watching his favorite TV shows on the sofa. In the middle of the night, when we had all fallen asleep, he would wake up and hear footsteps walking around the living room. He would also hear chains being dragged across the floor. At the time, we also had a dog. He said that our dog's head would follow the footsteps, and that was how he knew he wasn't just imagining it. The footsteps would lead into the kitchen, pausing for a moment before something dropped from the kitchen counter. Sometimes when one of us was alone in the house, we would hear little girls giggling and laughing in the bathroom at the end of the hall. I remember my dad talking to some of the adults in a serious tone. He said he could see the shadows of two people from underneath the door. He would open it after no reply, and there would be no one there. He would then notice that he was alone in the house. This was a common incident that many of us had experienced ourselves. My stepmom didn't like children, but she hid it very well from my dad. When he would leave for work, he would leave for 15 to 20-hour shifts. Sometimes she would put me in the basement and said if I couldn't behave myself like a person, I would be treated like an animal. The thing about being downstairs is that she would turn off the lights so that you would be downstairs and it would be completely black. It would feel like something was staring at me from the corner of the room. Something that was slowly creeping closer and closer to where I was sitting. Sometimes I would hear feet dragging in the distance, accompanied by tapping sounds similar to fingernails tapping on the concrete floor. This only happened soon after the sun had set and the basement was once again too dark to even see my hand waving in front of my face. As the sounds came closer and closer, I would hug my legs in a fetal position. At that point, I would sing a song from Anastasia, the one that my sister and I used to sing together, and hearing my voice made me feel less alone in that situation. Even as I felt the air thicken and the feeling of something weighing in next to me, waiting for me to open my eyes and take a look. Each time that I did manage to open my eyes in an attempt to see what it was, it would still be so dark that I didn't know if something was there or not. I learned how to toughen up and deal with that thing by treating it like a bully. Just don't let it get to you, don't let it bother you, I would tell myself. But the utter relief of the light turning on and being allowed to come back upstairs and watching my dad pull into the driveway was the best feeling in the world. Another one of my stepmom's favorite punishments would once again be in the basement. She would have my sister and I fold the clothes from the laundry machine. She would later tell one of us to go upstairs and then proceed to throw all of the clothes on the ground and then tell us to fold it again by ourselves. Downstairs, my sister and I knew that something was not right. The room had a TV and a small, dusty sofa. The door would always be open, and it felt like someone or something wanted you to come inside. It was almost magnetic. At times, we would have to go into the basement room whenever my stepmom had her friends over. We had to be quiet downstairs without a peep, or else she would get upset. Due to the giggling ghosts who were upstairs, we always seemed to get the blame, and were punished according to her mood. When I turned 12 or so, 2 of my dad's brothers moved into the house with us. One of my uncles slept in the guest bedroom, while their other uncle slept in the basement room. Sometimes we would go down there to see if he was hungry. When we entered the room, my uncle would be laying on the sofa with his eyes open, not blinking, and unresponsive. This would go on for a good hour or so. My dad said there wasn't anything downstairs, but he rarely went down there at all. My uncle said that there was something evil, and that it was trying to get into his body. My other uncle, who slept in the guest bedroom, said that when he was asleep he had a dream where a Confederate soldier without eyes kept screaming that they had been taken from him. He woke to see a floating blob of light right in front of his face. I remember one night as my sister and I were falling asleep, my dad kept yelling down the hall from the living room for us to stop talking and get some rest. He said it a few more times before my sister and I said we weren't talking. He then turned off the hallway light and said goodnight. Moments later I opened my eyes, and behind our bedroom door was a little girl in old pajamas. She had long black hair and nearly blended in with the shadows. I stared at her and then covered my head with my blanket. Later on, 2 of my cousins moved in after my uncles moved out. They had our old bedroom, and my sister and I took the guest bedroom. My cousins were both boys, and we were supposed to help them get used to living with us. They kept fighting with each other. The youngest one would climb into my bed in the middle of the night because he didn't want to fight with his older brother. We had a lock on our bedroom door, and that made him feel better. Also, he did mention that the bedroom scared him, but I didn't ask why. Eventually, the oldest one started to walk around the house at night. We found makeshift weapons like a stick with sharp rocks on it, and a strong thread with something sharp on it as well. He said he was going to kill our stepmother and everyone else in the house. He was maybe just 12 or 13 at the time. Eventually, law enforcement became involved, and he was deemed insane. Once my dad found out about my stepmother's abuse, he swiftly divorced her, and we moved. We never saw her again. One thing I remember is while we were moving out, the landlord stopped by and had baked us all cookies. My dad asked them if anyone had died in the house. The landlords were shocked and said, "Yeah, there was an older lady who died from depression upstairs in the attic." They then asked my dad how he knew. He told them about our experiences. They also mentioned that the house was built on an old battleground. To this day, sometimes I drive past the house and think about knocking on the tenant's door. I was around 12 when I had gotten a babysitting job with a family across town. The family was new to the area and just recently bought the house next to my best friend's place. My first day over was to get familiar with the kids and the house. The parents stayed and evaluated me and of course answered any questions that I had. I spent my time playing and keeping the children occupied. It was a boy named Devin, age 4, and a girl named Cameron, age 7, so I had my work cut out for me. Cameron wanted me to go to her room so she could show me her toys. I followed her up the 2 flights of stairs, but as we came to the top of the stairs, I felt strangely lightheaded, and the hair on my arms rose up. I had an intense feeling of being watched, like there was someone else up there with us. I tried to ignore the sensation and continue with my duties of finding Cameron's favorite doll so that we could go back downstairs. At the end of the day, it was decided that I was a good match, and I was to come back on Saturday morning. As I headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I got from that upstairs. I told myself, it's nothing, and I brushed it off to just being in a new place and unfamiliar surroundings. That Saturday morning, I showed up to a busy home as the parents tried to get out the door and show me the last-minute things that I needed for the day ahead. The kids were up in their PJs eating breakfast and already talking to me about all the fun things they wanted to do. After the parents left, I ushered the kids off to get changed. As I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes, I heard a loud bang come from the dining room. I ran back into the room and found one of the false ceiling tiles had fallen from its place. Puzzled, I tried to put it back, but it was not an easy task. After some struggling, I managed to fit it back in, and thought to myself, how could that have fallen out on its own? The day went on, and now it's close to lunchtime. The kids are watching TV, and I'm in the kitchen making something for lunch when I heard another loud bang coming from the dining area again. I look, and sure enough, the same tile was on the floor. This time I left it for the parents to see when they got home. Maybe they can fix it, I thought. Now the kids wanted to play hide and seek. We started off with Cameron seeking, and myself and Devin hiding. As Cameron started to count, we scurried around trying to find the best hiding place. I found the downstairs bathroom to be the best place for me. It was easy enough for Cameron to find me, and I hid Devin close to me so that I could keep an eye on him. As I entered the bathroom, I closed the door quietly behind me. I walked a few steps into the room and was now facing the mirror. As I was looking at my reflection, I also noticed something behind me that was moving. It was the closet door directly behind me, slowly opening. The closet door opened halfway and then slowly closed again, all by itself. I had the same feeling come over me like I did when I was upstairs on my first day. Wide-eyed with fear, I turned to the bathroom door and ran out. All I could think was, what just happened? I was really starting to worry that this house was haunted, and I now had every horror movie that I had ever watched playing through my head. Now I'm finding that I'm really uncomfortable, but I decide it's best to keep occupied. I break out a board game for us to play on the living room floor. Hungry Hippo, I think it was. We were playing for around 20 minutes before I noticed something again out of the corner of my eye, moving. I turned my head to see what it was. A child's shoe was tumbling across the floor all by itself. The kids stopped and watched in confusion. I was in disbelief. Cameron let out a scream, and she ran for the door. I grabbed up Devin and followed. We went to my friend's house next door and told her mom everything. I'm not sure if she believed me, but we stayed over there until the parents got home. When they showed up, we told them what we saw. I don't think they believed me either. I showed the panel that fell out. Apparently it's been an issue since they moved in, and as for the rest of my accounts, they chalked it up to an overly active imagination. I know what I saw and what I felt. I wasn't imagining anything. I later found out a bit of history on the house. Apparently, a man died in the house after a heart attack upstairs in a room above the dining room where the paneling kept falling out. I think that his spirit is still in that house, and that maybe he was just trying to play with us. This is by far the spookiest experience my family and I have had regarding the paranormal. I'm currently living in Australia, and this all started when I moved into my current house around 3 years ago. In my culture, we believe that whenever a family moves into a new home, a priest should come to perform various prayers to bless the house. However, when my mom bought the house, we immediately went on holiday for 3 months, so we were unable to perform the rituals. Everything started when we first came back home. Just some background. My mom raised me on her own, so it was just the two of us staying in the house at the time. I was still in high school, and my mom worked in the city, so we both took the train every morning. She always left home earlier than me, so it was my job to lock up each day. She also worked late almost every day, so I would get home first and be home alone for at least 5 hours. One morning as I left home, I began to feel paranoid that I had not locked the door, so I walked back to check it. The door was locked. Later that day, when I came home, I walked up my driveway to find that the door was wide open. I freaked out, but was brave enough to go inside. Our kitchen is pretty close to the entrance, so I grabbed a knife and searched the entire house. There was no one there. I decided to not tell my mom because she was really stressed with work and I didn't want her to freak out too. Over the next few days, another strange thing started to happen. Our garage door would randomly open whenever we were home. My mom was kind of scared, but then we thought maybe our neighbor's garage remote functioned at the same frequency or something and it was activating our door too, so we dismissed it. It had been about 2 months since we were living in our new house and everything seemed to be normal again. Until one day when I was awoken in the middle of the night by my mom. She looked super scared and asked me if I had come into her room to wake her up. I said no, I was half asleep and had no idea what she was rambling on about. She didn't believe me and made me swear that I hadn't. I always play scare pranks on my family, so that was why. I swore I didn't and asked her what was up. She is a super light sleeper, and so while she was sleeping, she heard someone prop her door open. She looked up and saw the figure of a boy and thought it was me. She asked it, "What's wrong?" and blinked. There was nothing there, and her door was still open. She called my name a few times and there was no response, hence why she came to my room. I have to admit, given the stuff happening with the doors, I was kinda scared, but I convinced my mom that she was imagining things and she went back to sleep. Ever since that night, and up to this day, my mom still sleeps with her door open and the living room light on. And I do not blame her after what happened next. 2 weeks after this incident occurred, my mom's best friend and her son and daughter, who were both around my age, came over from our homeland, Malaysia, to visit us. I was really excited, as I have always been close to them. One thing you should know about my aunt. She's had many experiences growing up with the paranormal, and so she is super afraid of ghosts. For this reason, me and her kids always used to play pranks on her. One day the 4 of us were playing poker on the dining room table while my mom was taking a nap in the living room. Suddenly my mom rushes out of the living room, her eyes wide open, and she looked terrified. She asked who had woken her up from her nap. The 4 of us were dumbfounded, as we had just been playing cards the entire time. She then told us that she felt someone tap her shoulder while she was asleep. When she opened her eyes, there were 2 feet on the floor. Once again she blinked, and the feet were gone, and there was no one there. My mom was having a full-on breakdown, especially after what had happened the other night. Then my aunt, given how afraid she was of ghosts, started to melt down as well. I didn't want her holiday to be ruined, so I managed to convince them that my mom was probably in the middle of a dream, so when she woke up, she was most likely hallucinating. Yeah, I know, it sounds stupid, but hey, it worked. But then the next day, something else happened. My mom had gone to the shops to get groceries. The kids and I were playing video games in the living room, while their mom was having a shower. Suddenly we hear the bathroom door burst open, and out runs my aunt wrapped in her towel. She screamed at us, telling us to stop trying to scare her, and that it wasn't funny. The three of us were extremely confused, and her daughter asked her what had happened. She told us that she knew we were the ones knocking on the bathroom door, even after she told us to stop 3 times. I know it probably seems like she was overreacting, but again, I cannot emphasize her fear of ghosts. I exchanged a concerned look with her kids, and then told her that it genuinely was not us, and that we were playing FIFA the entire time. Soon my mom got home, and we told her what happened also. Let's just say that my aunt started sleeping with her room lights on for the rest of her trip. Soon she and her kids had gone home, and it was back to me and my mom again. We returned to our regular routine. My mom was finally at peace, and she hadn't seen anything for a while apart from the garage door opening on its own every now and then. The same, however, could not be said for me. It seemed that it had become my turn to be tormented. As I mentioned before, with my mom at work, I would be home alone for a few hours every day. I began to start to hear things. The strange bit is that it would never occur while I was in the living room. Whenever I went to use the toilet or went to sit in my room, I would start hearing things coming from the living room and kitchen. It started out small, just the sound of some panting, like if you had run a marathon, that kind of panting. But the minute I entered the living room, nothing. There would be no sound at all. It soon started to get worse. I would hear footsteps pacing around outside my room and spoons and pots falling in the kitchen. But every time I step out into the living room again, the noises would stop, and everything would be just as I left it. There was even a time when I thought I heard a kid laughing right outside the door when I was in the toilet. I decided not to tell my mom again because she seemed to be getting over her experiences and I didn't want to scare her all over. But one day I felt that I needed to tell her, and we decided that day that it was time we contacted our priest to perform the prayers for our house. It was the day my best friend and his parents came over for dinner. When it all began, it was a completely innocent meal. My best friend and his family are Malaysian too, and we were having a great time talking about home while having a signature Malaysian dish. My friend's dad was telling us a story when all of a sudden his face just froze, and his eyes widened. He honestly looked like he was having a stroke. His face contorted into a frown, and he just stared down at the table. My mom and I shared a worrying look, but my friend and his mom just continued eating like nothing was happening. Suddenly, his dad seemed to return to us, and he continued telling the story as if nothing had occurred. But he could see that my mom and I were visibly concerned. Suddenly, his wife tapped his shoulder and said, "Just tell them." He frowned at his wife and just kept eating. There was an awkward silence for a few minutes, and then he finally decided to address the elephant in the room. He apologized for scaring us and assured us that there was no need to worry. He then went on to tell us about his life. Since he was a child, he had been very religious, and from a young age he felt a very close connection to God. He regularly meditated and was very, very spiritual. So spiritual that when he was in his mid-20s, he had awoken with a gift. He was able to see dead people. I kid you not, when he said this, I immediately looked at my friend, waiting for him to start laughing at some prank. But my friend's face was completely serious, and he continued looking at his dad as the man told his story. He told us he could see them everywhere, when he was walking his dog on the street, when he's sitting in the park, in people's houses, and even sometimes sitting on people who had been possessed. He said the spirits were drawn to him because they knew that he could see them, and they would stalk him, begging him to help them reach the afterlife. He said there was simply nothing he could do because these people had died before their time, and they would simply have to wait on Earth until it was their time. Back home, he was regularly contacted by people having paranormal experiences to perform a cleansing or drive evil spirits away. He told us about some of those experiences, but I don't feel like it's my place to share them here. He then asked us something that gave me chills. Have you guys performed prayers for your house yet? My mom refused to answer the question until he told her why he had asked it. He said that he didn't want to worry us, but that if we hadn't, we probably should. My mom continued to ask him why until he finally conceded. This is what he said. Remember when I had that moment just now while I was talking? I had a visit. I won't tell you what it was, but it was the same spirit that I saw standing at the front door when we came in here. That's when my mom told him everything that had been happening. It was during this time that I also decided to tell my mom about the things that I had been hearing in the house. My friend's dad then told us that he did not think it was a malicious spirit, but to be safe, and that it was time for us to conduct the prayers. Before he left, he asked my mom if he could see our altar in the prayer room. My mom took him to it and we all followed. As he stood in front of the altar, his whole body shook, as if he just had a huge hiccup. He then put his hands together and bowed his head. Before leaving, he said, "I can see why the two of you have not been hurt. You're protected." That concluded our visit. A week later, we arranged for a priest from our local temple to cleanse and bless our home. I promise you that ever since that day, nothing strange has ever happened in our house. Even the garage door has stopped opening on its own. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I have learned my lesson. I will never move into a house without performing the rituals that my culture demands. I would like to preface by saying that I am a Roman Catholic who has experienced paranormal phenomena since I was 5. My late grandmother had experienced similar phenomena, and my mother and sisters also, but to a much lesser degree. As I get older, I notice the experiences are slightly more darker in nature. I know very little of demonology, other than what has been referenced in the Bible. I try to stay away from anything referencing demons, the devil, etc., which is why this experience was so difficult and I was not prepared. In October of 2018, I was admitted to the hospital due to an electrolyte imbalance. I was in a room with 3 other female patients. On my second night, my arms were finally free of the IV, so I was able to move around and assist the other women, who weren't as mobile, in getting ready for bed. One of the women was much older and cranky. She seemed to take an instant dislike to me when I first moved into the room, but warmed up to me after I helped her. When the lights went out, I decided to lay on my stomach and say my silent prayers. To the casual observer, it would have looked as if I was asleep. During this time, I could hear the woman that I helped argue with herself about me. She stated that I was nice, and then she replied to herself stating that I am not what I seem or something to that effect, and it went back and forth like that during my prayers. Shortly after, the room started getting really cold, really fast. I silently prayed to God to watch over her and free her from any negative influences. It was then that I heard her say these words very loudly. I don't know the Lord's Prayer, and my name. I freaked out, quickly processing what had just happened. The woman knew that I was praying over her, and there was no way that she could have known that. In my mind, I instinctively knew that I was not up for the confrontation. I was weak and still recovering. I got up from my bed, and with my back to her, I said something like, "There's no way I can stay here now." To which she answered, "Yes, go." I won, and laughed really hard. I was amazed that the other 2 women had slept through it. It was around 10 p.m. when this occurred. The room was stiflingly cold at this point, and I ran to reception and asked to be discharged, but the charge nurse said that I couldn't leave without my doctor discharging me. I begged again to be discharged, but was denied, and the nurses tried to call me as they got a hold of my doctor, who said that he would be in at 7 a.m. and that I needed to stay put. I asked to be relocated to another room in the interim, but the only available room was directly next door, and that was way too close for my liking, so they put me in the day room with a blanket and pillow. I used my phone to call my sister to get me out of the hospital. She works at another hospital, and told me the car wasn't home and to catch an Uber to her place. The ward was locked down for the evening though, so I couldn't leave anyway, and chose to just stay in the day room. The TV was on standby, but I could hear voices coming from it, even though the screen was blank. The voices talked about a shooting at the hospital I was in, with thousands of fatalities. It then talked about my baby nephew being in a plane that was shot down. By then, I was truly hysterical, as fear for my family took root and everything I learned went out the window. Throughout this time, the voices from the TV continued, calling me names, etc. I couldn't stay any longer in the day room, and the nurses had me on a stretcher right in front of the main desk, where the charge nurse could see me. It felt like a really bad dream, and I was hysterical and paranoid. I laid down on the stretcher, and that's when I noticed hanging overhead the ward number 66. I was also on the 6th floor of the hospital. I wondered if that was why there was so much activity there. Not long after, I started hearing other voices coming from different rooms of the ward asking about me. They seemed to be communicating to each other and laughing. I started silently praying again with more conviction. A male patient in the ward nearest my stretcher started crying out for help, claiming that I was hurting him. I prayed even harder, citing the Lord's Prayer. He asked the nurse for the name of the lady outside hurting him, and she gave him my first name. He started crying again, joined by another voice 2 doors down. I prayed to know who they were in Jesus' name, and all these voices talked at once, but the one name that I could clearly make out was Beelzebub. I continued to pray throughout the first night as they taunted, laughed, cackled, and cried. At this point, the light in the man's hospital room was turned on as a nurse was with him trying to calm him down. I had been sitting up on my stretcher bed whilst praying, and watched his silhouette as he tried to inch his way to the open doorway. It was then that I noticed the odd shadow that he cast. It was so strange. It looked like a spiky-headed being with a dog. Spiky-headed in an almost cartoonish way like Bart Simpson. It continued until morning, and I was moved to a small private room awaiting the doctor. The voices were still verbally attacking and threatening me, but my hysteria was long gone by that point, and I was just determined to leave. I ended up discharging myself before the doctor arrived, but had to return as I still had the IV catheter in my arm. On my return, they placed me in another ward. I refused to go back to Ward 66, and I was allowed to recover in peace. And eventually, the mnemonic taunting stopped. I had a course of bad luck following that event. Basically, all of 2019 was a series of misfortunes and bad luck that still hasn't come right. I don't know what to do other than just keep moving on. I went to a psychiatrist last December who said that other than the trauma I would need their help with, I was in good mental health. While I was growing up, around the age of 3 until 6 or 7, I had an invisible friend. He would only show up every once in a while. I thought maybe he was lonely and also needed a friend. I disliked the feeling of someone not having a friend when I was little, so I gently worked hard to be his friend, just so that he would have someone. Usually he would appear whenever my stepmom would be mean to us, and we were left alone for a bit afterward, or when I was scared or was having a paranormal experience, which at the time I didn't understand. My teacher was fond of me and told my dad that I was special and could grow into either a very bad or a very good person. While the other kids would play on the playground together, I would sit on the hill and just enjoy the grass and trees and wind, and my teacher would sit down next to me, enjoying it in silence as well. I remember one time the other kids were on the playground, and without being told to, stopped playing and sat down with us, and we all just sat on the hill enjoying the breeze. It was a pretty nice memory, just all of us enjoying the silence and having a moment, until the school bell rang. My dad didn't think that the little boy was fake, while my stepmom tried to get me to see a specialist. My dad did eventually take me to a specialist in order to make my stepmom happy because they constantly argued about it. I remember that at our last appointment I was in the waiting room. My dad opened the door and went into her office, and I remember as my dad's back was turned to me that the specialist concluded that nothing was wrong with me, that I was just a normal kid. My dad said something along the lines of, "I thought so, thank you," and he took me out for ice cream afterward. My dad later opened up to me after his divorce and said that in every generation some of the kids have gifts and that some people don't like what they can't understand, and that's why he thought my old friend wasn't made up. To this day, I don't know if he was a ghost or an invisible friend I made up as a little girl. But I do remember that he had his own personality that I was not in control of. He never really talked about anything, like about his life, even if I asked him questions. He just wanted to play, or he would show up and say, "It's going to be okay." I remember after a while, as my stepmom hated it more and more, he sort of slowly went away. Sometimes I would call out for him, which I didn't do before, and he wouldn't show up. Sometimes when I would cry, I would sort of wait for him, hoping a little bit that he would show up, but he never did. I eventually forgot about the little boy until one day in middle school. It felt like something which was not very good was in my bedroom with me that night. The house was oddly quiet. I figured I was being silly, so I fell asleep. That night, I had a dream that I was inside of a broken-down city as a girl again. It was a misty night with puddles on the road. I could even feel the rain falling lightly on my skin. I remember that my hair was wet. The city seemed to be empty. The street lights looked old, and there weren't any lights on anywhere. Many of the building's windows were broken. Inside of the rooms were dusty and unkept. I also noticed that there wasn't any furniture inside of them or lights or doors. It was just rooms. I called out, and my voice kind of echoed as the rain tapped the ground. I noticed rather quickly that I wasn't alone. Something heard me. As a figure of something slowly crept in the distance on the street behind me, I looked closer, but it wasn't a person. I heard a loud screech, and I instantly started to run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Whatever was inhabiting that city wasn't expecting me. Suddenly, I was being chased by a bunch of shadowy, semi-human-looking things. They ran fast and would jump from the wall of one building to another building, clinging onto the sides, the bricks falling and hitting the streets and the sidewalks behind me. They nearly caught up to me until I turned the corner and started to run over to an old wooden fence on the outskirts of the city. I felt the water on the grass, and I think I slipped at least once. I saw the little boy on the other side of the dark, brown, worn-down fence, and he said, "Take my hand." I did, and as we ran away through an open field in an attempt to reach some woods on the other side, those things were moments away from catching us. Their claws dug into the ground. Some of the speckles of dirt flew past my face. Then I woke up. On my ceiling above my bed there was a huge man in armor and medium-length brown hair. His hair moved and little parts of his clothes moved with it, as if they were submerged. But it didn't look to me like he had been near water. He had a silk cloth. It was either red or purple. The only way I remember it is because part of it had floated steady near his hair and face. Light seemed to emit not only from his body but from underneath his skin as well. As I looked at his face, he had an expression of warmth and calm, and it felt like we knew each other. He seemed so familiar. Only the area from the top of his head until about his waist or a little below it could fit within the space of my ceiling. I remember his eyes. It was like he were trying to tell me something, that he was the little boy the entire time, and it was going to be okay. The only way that I can describe the feeling of familiarity I had is, you know the feeling when you see someone after a while and you realize you knew each other when you were kids? Eventually, after what felt like a longer time than what it probably was, the man faded away, and it was just me in my empty room. That morning when I went upstairs to fix myself some breakfast, my uncle was talking in the living room about having a dream. I didn't really catch what his dream was about, though, until he mentioned that he woke up in the middle of the night when he heard aggressive scratching and banging on his door. My dad didn't believe him, so he brought my dad and my sister and I downstairs to show us that it was true, to show my dad that he wasn't making it up. There were long, deep scratches on the other side of his bedroom door from the hallway. I can't explain what happened or what had made those scratch marks. I usually don't open up about my experiences. I honestly haven't had the courage to until a few days ago. Rarely have I shared them. I still haven't told my family about my dream, or the man I had seen either, but they still talk about the scratches. Whilst I've always been skeptical and evidence-based, I've never been able to shake this experience. My mother and her sisters have all had what may be termed as paranormal experiences, but without my personal experience, I had only thought of them as intriguing stories. As I take after my mom, though, I'm male. It's possible that they may have a perception which I share. This might be relevant later. In the mid-1990s, when I was around 21, I moved into the top floor of a 3-story building in Birmingham, Edgbaston, UK, which had been converted into flats. Mine had its own small landing and separate bedroom and lounge/kitchen. I also had 2 kittens, who play their own role in this. Having previously shared a house with friends and being young, this was my first time by myself, which may explain the feeling. But it was a very tranquil place. With the exception of my current house, it was the most peaceful place I've lived in. Again, this may be relevant later. Nothing of any real pertinence happened for the majority of the time I lived there, but I would often be listening to music for hours with my eyes closed, absorbing every note, frequently Nick Drake, whom I had recently discovered, and felt as though someone was sitting there listening with me. I didn't pay too much attention to this, with my very scientific background and all, but the sensation was as though someone was sitting right next to you and you closed your eyes. You would know or sense that they were there. It's hard to explain, but it somehow felt nice, and I got used to it, putting it down to my own imagination, though. Fairly often, the 2 kittens would be playing in the lounge, and both suddenly stop and stare at the same spot on the wall, then follow something around the room together. Again, I thought nothing of it for a while, but then realized that there was never an insect or reflection which they could have been looking at. Eventually, with the frequency of this combined with the feeling of a presence, whenever I saw them doing it, I would tell them to quote-unquote stop watching the ghost, although, of course, the tone in which I was using was very much tongue-in-cheek. Another curiosity with them was that they would refuse to enter the bedroom, or quickly leave if carried in there. It was something else I didn't pay attention to until much later. I had lived there for about a year and a half and decided that I would save some money and share a house with someone that I knew. When I told the landlord, he commented that of all his properties, this one was very much an outlier and that no one, apart from me, had ever stayed there more than a few weeks or a couple months, and that I had been there 18 to 24 months. So, a few weeks before moving out, the first noticeable thing happened. At the foot of my bed is an outside wall with a small window to the left. As I lay down in bed one night, the only light was moonlight and a distant street lamp. I closed my eyes and realized that although dark, I could still see the room around me. I thought my eyes must be open, so I scrunched them shut to be sure. It sounds odd, I know, but I could still see, and was definitely not asleep. I was both marveling at and trying to understand whatever craziness this was when I had what I could only describe as an out-of-body experience. I began floating up toward the ceiling, stopping at a few feet away, and then floated toward the foot of the bed and outside wall. Admittedly, I was now in a panic, as I didn't know what was happening, but the overriding fear was floating through the wall and not returning, so I tried to shake myself back down somehow. I then had that falling sensation that you get in dreams, and the jolt when you wake up. Despite feeling like I was awake the entire time, I put it down to having fallen asleep immediately and going straight into a dream. A week later, and my final week at the flat, I went to bed one night. I closed my eyes and again could see the room around me. As I looked around again with my eyes closed, I was first excited at being able to repeat this, but then remembered the out-of-body experience. That worried me, so I opened my eyes so that it might not happen again, but also to know for certain that I was awake. As I looked across to the diagonally opposite corner of the room where the window was, I looked slightly left at the standalone wardrobe and saw the image of a young woman standing there, about 12 feet away, staring at me. Her image was formed by misty white and dark shadow, and I saw that she had long, straight, shiny hair as a standout feature. And no, this is way before the original Ring films. I can imagine what some people might think. Of course, it scared the living crap out of me. I tried to put it down to tired eyes and the moonlight making the shape, but then she slowly made her way to the bed and, as best as I could make out, leaned over as if she were about to kiss me goodnight. With all my bravery and rational thinking, I pulled the covers over my head, scared out of my mind, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and I don't know how long I laid there waiting, but I eventually went to sleep. I thought that was it, and the next day put it down to an overactive imagination despite what I've shared above. I later moved out without telling anyone of this for fear of being labeled a crazy person. A few weeks later, I'm with my dad in his car one evening, and we drive past the house. We both look at it and notice the lounge light is on in the top floor window. He says it looks like someone has moved in already, to which I replied, thinking that he would just laugh and call me silly, "Yeah, either that or it's the ghost." To my surprise, he looks at me with a stern face and asks if I'm being serious. That worries me. He pulls the car over and says that it's really important, and he's deadly serious, to let him know if there's anything I should tell him. So I start relaying to him what I've said above, and he's obviously concerned. He asks me to describe her, and once I have, he replies, "Yep, that's her." I think I was more shocked at that moment than the night I actually saw her. He then tells me, "When I said where you had moved to, your nan wanted you to move out right away, but we didn't say anything to you as we didn't want to worry you. Your nan's next-door neighbor had a daughter, and she was murdered in that flat by someone she worked with one New Year's Eve." My nan's neighbors were roughly the same age, so this would have been the late 60s or early 70s. "You just described her exactly," he said. And the police said that when they found her, she had not long had a bath and had been strangled with her dressing gown belt. One thing they remarked upon was how long and shiny her hair was. still gives me chills. But this wasn't the end of it. At this point, I still hadn't told anyone apart from close family about my experience. I was trying to avoid the loony label. I was in my early 40s and working at a company as a software tester. As I say, my mindset is technical and fact-oriented. A guy starts on my team, 10 years my senior, but we have the same interests and personality, and we get on great. We're still friends to this day. A horror movie had just come out, so we're talking about it, which leads to talk of other similar movies, and then he tells me about a scary experience he once had himself. He said that he was lying in bed one night, and suddenly had the sensation of being strangled. He said it was so vivid that he swore it was real, but opened his eyes and no one else was there. He lived by himself in a flat. I asked him where this was. Same area. I asked him the road, same road, house number, flat, same one. He'd lived there about 10 years prior to my stay in it. That was the first time that I then told someone else about what I had been through. If this was paranormal, did she show herself to me because of the links between our families? Is this why the flat was so peaceful for me and not previous tenants, if that was why they had moved? Could I see her because of some ability, however small, which does run in my family? Is this what the kittens could sense? I've had a few other separate experiences, and so has my family, but they're for another post. Despite that experience, I'm still skeptical. There are so many questions that I just can't wrap my head around. For example, how would a spirit have conscious thought or action? How do clothes become part of an apparition? Why do we have little, if any, hard evidence? At the same time, I have no other explanation for what happened other than it was a lot of weird coincidences. I understand that to many this is just someone else's story, but at the same time, there is still an unthinkable amount of secrets to the universe that humanity has yet to unlock. So for some backstory, my mother has breast cancer, and before our town got a cancer treatment center at the hospital, my mother would have to travel to a city 4 hours away to get treatment. At times, this would be 3 days. She would leave, get treated, and then come back on the 3rd day. At this time, my brother was in his early teens and was going through that rebellious stage of his life. So guess who gets called to look after him when my mother does her treatments? Day 1. My mother leaves early, about 6 in the morning, and tells me that she would send me a text message once she gets to her hotel. I came around yesterday so that my mother could leave early and told her to have a safe trip. Eventually my brother wakes up to get ready for school. This is on a Friday. I give him his lunch, and he's off. I spend my day just sitting around my mother's house, giving her cat some attention, giving the dog some food, watching TV. The basics, really. Sure enough, my brother returns back from school and we do the typical brother things. Night comes, he goes to bed, and I stay up for a little while watching TV. About 10, I turn it off and make my way to the spare room where I was staying while Mom was away. I get underneath the blanket and close my eyes. As I could feel myself on the verge of sleep, I hear it. Thud, 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 thud. It was the sound of footsteps, as though someone was quickly moving back and forth through the living room. My eyes shot open, and my thoughts quickly went to burglar. Someone was in my mother's house, moving around, trying to find something to steal. But as I listened, I noticed something else. I would hear it, then a pause, and then again, like someone was running back and forth, only stopping for a moment just to do it all over. The sound was too light for a grown person, but sounded more like that of a child. I sighed, believing this to be my brother. My mom had told me before she left about how my brother would sneak out of his room to grab his phone or Game Boy and play it when he was meant to be sleeping. Thinking this was the case, I get out of bed and make my way into the living room. As I did, the noise stopped. I continued on up to my brother's room. I opened the door and peeked in. He looked like he was sleeping, but looks can be deceiving. I returned to the living room and I decided to pretend to have fallen asleep on the couch so that I could catch my brother in action. Somehow I actually did fall asleep. I awoke to something brushing my nose. Turns out it was the dog. I look around to see the slightest of light coming in the windows. If I had to guess, it was maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. Tired, I get up and make my way back to bed. Once again, as I felt myself about to drift off, the noises started up again. In my tired state, I just concluded that it must be possums in the roof, and went back to sleep. Day 2. It was Saturday, so I let my brother sleep in. The lazy butthole didn't get up until 11. It went well. We hung out, had lunch, played some games, nothing really major. Well, not until that night. Once again, I stayed up while my brother went to bed, and again, around 10, I turned the TV off and went to go to sleep. Sure enough, just as I was about to drift off, thud, 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 thud. Those darn possums, I moaned to myself. Then I heard a little girl giggle. My eyes shot open after hearing that, and the running resumed. I sat up, hearing the playful running back and forth in the living room. I just sat there trying to figure out where this little girl's giggle had come from. It sounded like a 7 or a 10-year-old. I turned to the window, seeing the next-door neighbor's light still on. I began to think that the noise I was hearing was coming from them, that maybe they had a little girl over and she was just being a pest. It was a good possibility, except for one thing. The couple who lived there were old and didn't have any grandkids. I heard that giggle again, much clearer now, like it was just in the living room, which was just outside my door. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Day 3. That morning I was uneasy, but was glad that my mother was returning. About 1 p.m. she got back home, and I began to pack up to return home myself, but the events of the past 2 nights still stuck with me as I returned back to her. Getting the courage, I asked her if she had ever heard a little girl in that house. "Oh, her?" my mother states. "Yeah, she's quite a mischievous one, isn't she?" I just smiled and left. I spent other nights there looking after my brother, but never heard from her again, and when my mother moved to another house with another ghost, I felt like she traded one for another. But that's a different story. When I was in middle school, my mother and father did not live together. Eventually, we all moved into this apartment together in the local town. The local town is peaceful, calm, and barely any crime happens here. Obviously, when you're a kid, you can get scared of the dark and stuff like that. However, this wasn't just being afraid of what lurks in the darkness, because there was actually something watching me as I fell asleep. The first night I slept there, I just kept getting the feeling as if something was staring at me from the hallway. My bed was almost completely centered to where the door was, and my door was always open, so I would always be able to see what was outside. And I would just stare, always, down the hallway, thinking that something was looking back at me. It wasn't long after that before I started actually having paranormal encounters. The first paranormal encounter I ever had, one night I was sleeping in my bed. I remember feeling like something was watching me again, except this time I rolled over to see a large, black, shadowy man standing in my doorway. My eyes began to tear up, and I hid under my sheets, but this strange pressure came over my body. It was almost as if I couldn't breathe or talk, and then my ears would start ringing, and I would fall asleep with a snap of a finger. Then I would have this nightmare of my parents coming into my room slowly, coming over to my bedside table and screaming at me. Their faces would just rot away into this deep, black shadow face, which I named Black Eyes. I would then wake up, usually in a completely different room, not knowing what I was doing. Sometimes I would be standing in the bathroom, or laying on the couch in the living room. A few times I would be standing over my parents' bed, just looking at them. This event reoccurred more times than I can even count. Then, finally, my family began to notice the figure as well. My mother at the time would have friends over and they would say something like, "Did you just see that man walk down your hallway?" She would see it too. The same thing that I saw that would stare at me and put me to sleep at night. There would be strange events around the apartment, such as the TV changing channels, random phone calls from unknown numbers in the middle of the night. One of the most random occurrences in the house would be the random, horrible smell of death coming from the bathroom. This happened about once a week at a random hour. Nobody could figure out why the bathroom would smell like rotting death, and no matter how hard my mother attempted to clean the bathroom, the smell would not go away until about 2 hours later. It would just randomly disappear, with no explanation as to what it could have been. Many people who came over would see this shadow figure. My father didn't want to believe it, as he didn't believe in ghosts, but my mother was fully prepared. She had lived in a haunted house before and wasn't surprised by what was happening. Nobody would act like they believed me when I tried to tell them what I was seeing and why I was sleepwalking at night, but in reality, I think my mother was scared. She didn't want to tell me, with me being a kid and all, that I was possibly being possessed by this shadow man and being forced to walk around the house at night. Then came one night when we had to call the police. There was music coming from downstairs around 1 to 2 a.m. We knew that the downstairs neighbors had just moved out of the apartment, but we were awoken by this church-type music. We informed the police, and they came down to the apartment only to find a locked door. They busted it down to find absolutely nothing but music on a track playing by itself in the middle of the room. We were informed of this, and that only created more of a mystery. It was evident by that point that there was something in that apartment. Something dark. Something that didn't have good intentions. Eventually, after a few years, we decided it was time to move out. We had gotten a puppy, and she was barking down the hallway at nothing, and one night a plate fell onto the ground from the cabinet. It was time to go. The final night in the apartment, my mother and I both awakened to a horrible noise of what sounded like a chainsaw destroying the kitchen cabinets. We both ran out to turn on the lights and find absolutely nothing. We both looked at each other like, "Did you hear that?" But couldn't say anything, and went back to bed. It was completely terrifying. I'm not sure what we were dealing with at this apartment. I'd like to say that it was just a ghost, but it seemed powerful. I believe in the paranormal, but I'm skeptical about most of the stories that people tell. It's extremely hard to distinguish between a fabricated story and a true story when you can't see facial expressions or hear changes in a person's voice. About a week ago, I was sitting in my kitchen browsing the web, probably Reddit, on my phone. My kids had been asleep for about an hour, and my wife was in our room finishing up a paper for work. There wasn't a radio or television on. While browsing in complete silence, I heard my wife cough several times. The cough sounded as if she had breathed in some water and was trying to get it out of her lungs. Jokingly, I jumped out of my chair and ran over to the room where she was sitting. I started patting her back and pulling her earlobes down, again in a joking manner. She looked at me like, what the hell? So I told her I was trying to help since she had coughed so hard. She, still with the what the hell face, looked at me and said that she hadn't coughed. I stood there and evaluated what I may have heard. I thought it might have been one of my kids, but the cough was from a woman. It wasn't a 4-year-old or 1-year-old girl's cough. Other things about this cough is that it came from inside the house. It was the type of hack like after water goes down the wrong pipe. It was one succession of coughs, about 4 of them together. How did the coughing not continue if the coughs were heard that hard at the beginning? It didn't and still does not make sense. But that's not the only thing that happened. Fast forward to the next morning. My kids are awake and eating in the kitchen. I'm in the living room watching TV, still waking and drinking coffee, and my wife is in our room getting ready for the day. All electronics are off except the TV and our phones. My wife's phone rings from what sounds like the kitchen area. She runs to the kitchen to answer it because she was expecting an important phone call from work. She searches for her phone in the kitchen, but does not find it. She asks if it was my phone that rang, but I told her no. My phone was in my pocket. Turns out, both my wife's work phone and personal phone are in our room on the other side of the house. We checked the kitchen and surrounding rooms for anything that could have made the ring, but we found nothing. I don't know the name of the ringtone, but it's a very common ringtone for iPhones. My wife and I searched for the reasoning of why we clearly heard a phone ring in the kitchen, but no matter how hard we tried, we were unable to find a logical explanation. I was going to write it off as just another weird coincidence, but I kept thinking of how clear the phone ringing was, and how my wife had heard it too. Add this one to the cough that I heard the night before, and I start to worry that there may be an intruder in my attic. I think, nah, not possible. But I have 2 little girls and a little boy too. It's a slim chance, but I'd feel better if I just went up there and checked. I texted my wife to watch the kids because I was worried that there might be an intruder. I didn't want to verbalize it because if they were up there, then they would hear me. I check outside and around the house first for any signs of a person being on the roof or anything like that. I look for cuts in the wall and see no signs of intrusion whatsoever. I then grab the ladder to get inside the attic. The only way into this attic is through a small 2x4 foot opening at the top of the interior of a closet in one of the rooms. I grab my flashlight and my gun, set the ladder up, and plan on entering the attic as quickly and tactfully as possible. I don't want the intruder to be lying in wait. I push the drywall that blocks the opening and can hear a door swing and shut. I say swing because it sounded like a door that was on a hinge or hinges. I can't get the drywall off, and the element of surprise is now gone. I push through anyway and inspect the attic. The attic has no floorboards. You have to navigate through it by standing on the supporting beams. It's extremely annoying to have to go up there to do housework. I find no signs of anyone being up there, no entry points, and again, no cuts in any of the walls. I come down and double check that my wife and kids had stayed in the living room like I had asked in case there was an intruder. She confirms that they were, and that no door had been shut. I pretty much already knew that the door shutting wasn't them because the sound came from the attic, but there's no door in the attic. I went through a checklist of explanations to the cough, the phone ring, and the door shutting, and again, have yet to encounter a single one that makes sense. I know it sounds weird, but a freaking portal is what I'm coming up with. I lived in this house for years, and have always heard weird noises, but never something like this. Most portal stories I've heard sound totally far-fetched. Usually a portal story includes a demon or something spiritual, but this was just totally random. People crossing dimensions to hang out in my attic. There's no malice, no sightings, no physical evidence, but the sounds were definitely heard and are inexplicable. Something else happened a few nights ago. It was around 11 p.m. I'm asleep in bed and am woken up to my wife shaking me. She tells me that she heard a door close. I say to her that it may be our 4-year-old, but she says she was watching the monitor and the cameras were on the kids. She said that she had been watching the monitor because she had been hearing weird noises. I say maybe it's just the house creaking. She claims that she heard the windows shake. Now this is significant to me because we do have some old windows. The difference between the old and new windows is that the old windows will rattle when a door is shut due to air pressure or when the house is shaking, earthquakes, and the new windows won't. So she heard a door close and the windows shake. That's enough for me to grab my gun and check for an intruder yet again. I do an interior and exterior check and of course find nothing. I go back to bed and once again conclude that there is a portal in my house. I had a strange babysitting experience the other night. Everything was normal until the kids were in bed, and so I was just scrolling through random vids on Instagram to pass the time. I was watching one, and I heard something. It was as if a man or one of the boys pretending to have a deep voice was upstairs, said "no" or something in a weirdly growly voice. I was confused and a little spooked, so I brushed it off and sat on the couch to watch a movie. Their dog was walking around and growling at the windows that led to the backyard. That creeped me out too, but again I just brushed it off as the dog seeing a squirrel or something. At this point it's around 10 p.m. He then was laying on my lap and started growling and barking toward the kitchen. At this point I was like, come on man, you better cut that out. Because who on earth wouldn't be creeped out by that? Later, I heard these incredibly light, whispery voices like children. I wasn't completely sure if it was just the kids waking up and making noise, but it only lasted for a moment after I noticed. I noticed those weird things, but I really didn't put them together until later that night. I talked to my mom after, and she told me that my sister and her friend had babysat there as well, and they both had an odd experience, i.e. bad vibes, the kids telling her that she's seen some things, and the kids actually addressing something that wasn't there. My mom didn't tell me before so that I wouldn't be spooked, which I guess was good because I got an independent witness of whatever happened without being influenced by other people's experiences. But anyways, that's what took place. I'll still go back and babysit. I'll just be prepared to throw hands with Casper. When I was around 12 years old, my family and I moved into a semi-detached house just up the street from our previous home. The house wasn't very big, and the floor plans for our part of the house were completely different from our neighbors. Our neighbors were a lovely little family of 4. Husband is from England, wife from Norway, which is where I live. They also had a 3-year-old little girl and a 6-month-old baby boy. Now, I love children, always have, and at that time I really wanted to start babysitting. It's quite common to start babysitting at age 12, and I was turning 13 a month later anyway, so I wanted to find some small job. As we got to know our neighbors over the next few months of living there, my parents told the neighbors that if they ever needed a sitter, then it would be nice if they would consider trying me out. Seeing as it would be my first job as a babysitter, we thought it would be smart to start with my next-door neighbors, seeing as my parents would literally be on the other side of the wall just in case anything happened. Cut to a Friday night when my neighbors went to a party that was happening just down the street. I got there at around 8 p.m., and the parents told me that they would come home at around 2 to 3 a.m. Both kids were already sleeping, so they told me to just put on a movie and relax. These kids were the easiest to babysit ever. Once you put them to bed and they fell asleep, absolutely nothing would wake them up. They are some of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen, so babysitting them was usually pretty uneventful. I was on the couch watching Avatar in the living room on the 2nd floor. The kids had their own separate bedrooms that were just downstairs where the front door was. I could basically see their bedrooms from where I was sitting, as the place was quite small. Because of the hallway, I couldn't see the front door. Again, this house was very small, so as long as the TV wasn't on too loud, then I could hear everything that happened downstairs. At around midnight, I heard the front door unlock, and my neighbors walked in while talking. I heard them close the door, and I heard them start taking off their jackets and their shoes. I thought it was a bit weird that they hadn't called to let me know that they were coming home early, but I just assumed that it must have slipped their minds, so I went downstairs to greet them. I could hear them talking up until the point that I came around the corner to the hallway that led to the door. There was no one there. The talking fell silent the second that I turned the corner. The only sound was from the TV upstairs. My heart started beating so fast and my head was rushing. I ran to the bedrooms and checked the kids before I searched the rest of the house. I opened every door, checked every cabinet for anything that would explain what had just happened, but there was nothing there. The kids were still sound asleep. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. I checked the kids one last time and made certain that the doors were wide open so that I could see them from upstairs. I sat down to finish the movie whilst trying to process what had just taken place. But when I sat down, I noticed that the TV had been shut off, even though I had left it on. When I turned it back on, there was just snow on the screen. I couldn't for the life of me get it to work again. That's when the talking downstairs started up all over. Not only that, but the baby started screaming bloody murder. This baby never woke up from naps, and definitely wouldn't ever scream the way that it did that night. I have never in my life run down a staircase as fast as I did then. I rushed toward the baby's bedroom, only to find the door closed. I ripped it open, picked the baby up, and rushed to pick up his sister. I took them both upstairs and held those kids for almost 3 hours before the parents came back home. The talking and sounds downstairs came and went, as I had the kids with me on the couch. I held them as close to me as I could, and tried my best to help them stay asleep. As the parents came home, I was too scared to walk downstairs to greet them. I couldn't be sure if it was even actually them or not, until they walked up the stairs where they found me clutching their children. Obviously, they noticed that I was upset and asked me what had happened. I honestly felt like I had lost my mind at that point, but I told them the story anyway. After I was finished, they told me that it wasn't the first time anything like that had happened there. Apparently, they heard voices all the time at night. I was kind of mortified that they didn't think to warn me before, but they said that they were sorry that this had happened to me, and the mom walked me home to my house. I slept with the lights on for almost a month after that. Believe it or not, I did go back and babysit those kids again. I was 15 when the first time anything paranormal happened to me at this boarding school. For a month, I would have sleep paralysis. The next month, it got 10 times worse. As well as sleep paralysis, I would feel someone or something patting my head. I would open my eyes, and no one was there. This would carry on for a little while, until one night when I had sleep paralysis again and I looked over to the other side of the room and saw a slightly washed out figure of a woman wearing a maid's costume. This happened for a couple more nights until I left that school. I came back to that school for 6th form, the last 2 years of high school if you're American. It all started up again when I was moved into that same dorm, but this time she followed me around the school. In the end, I prayed for her. However, she still follows me around when I wear a certain necklace to this day. The last story I have is about 18-year-old me messing around with a Ouija board. Please don't do this. So my boyfriend at the time was the one who bought the Ouija board. A good friend had just died a couple of months ago. We messed around with it for a little bit until the planchette started to levitate. I somehow went into a trance for what felt like about 30 seconds. However, I got told it was for 5 minutes. When I came out of this trance, I had 3 scratches down my arm. The hand with scratches was red hot to the touch, but the other was ice cold. Of course, we decided to do it again the next night. Something predicted the future. The first thing it said was fire alarm. The next thing was knee surgery. And the last was asylum. As soon as this happened, the fire alarm went off. A year later, I had knee surgery. And then 6 months later, my ex was admitted to a mental facility. I know this sounds far-fetched, but this is what happened. Again, please don't mess around with Ouija boards. When I was approximately 15 years old, circa 1988-89, myself and my family had 2 summer holidays in Portugal, one following on from the previous year. The first holiday included myself, my older sister, mom and dad, and an uncle and aunt. The second holiday the following summer was the same people, except my sister, who stayed at home. Both holidays were in the same location, and both times we stayed in the same villa, which was owned by a business associate of my uncle. As such, I believe the accommodation was free, and that's why it was such a great holiday option for us all. The villa was situated about a 15 minutes walk outside of a well-known town. The first holiday where my sister was also present was event-free, and nothing unexplained happened at all. The second holiday was where I alone experienced an absolutely terrifying paranormal event, which has stayed with me to this day. The villa we stayed in was on one level, as most villas are, and had a pretty standard layout. The main door at the front led straight into a kitchen, and that led into the main lounge area. Off to the left and the right of the main lounge were 2 ensuite bathrooms where my parents and uncle and aunt slept. I slept on a fold-out bed in the lounge area, and out to the back of the property was a small swimming pool. From memory, it was a very nice, spacious villa, and probably worth quite a bit of money. Nothing happened for the entire 2-week period that we were there, except for the final night of the holiday. I often say thank God that we flew home the next morning, because I don't think I could have stayed there another night. On this final evening, everyone had just gone to bed and closed their doors, and I had just finished setting up my bed and finally turned out the lights and got under the covers. No longer than 30 seconds after getting into bed, I began to hear tapping on one of the walls. I laid there trying to guess what it might be, and just figured that it was probably one of my parents or uncle or aunt doing something in their rooms, so I ignored it. I then heard the same tapping again, but louder. I sat up in bed and tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. This is how I know that it wasn't sleep paralysis, as some people have often suggested to me, because I was peering across the dimly lit lounge room. It was then that the tapping started to spin around the room, as if the knocking was circling me as I sat there. This was naturally pretty unnerving, and I struggled to rationalize what was taking place. It was at that point that the tapping stopped, and immediately a wooden chair from the lounge room dining table made a scraping sound against the wood parquet floor that it was resting on. The sort of scraping noise a chair would make if you pulled it out from under the table to sit on it. At this point, I didn't know what was going on, and being as young as I was, I think fear got the better of me, and I shot down into the bed, turned around, and pulled the sheets up under my chin and closed my eyes. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. Next, I heard more scraping as dining chairs were being moved, followed by a very quiet but very distinct shuffling noise, which sounded like shuffling footsteps. These footsteps got louder as whatever it was began to approach me in the room. As it approached, I then heard this mumbling in what sounded like guttural, low-key talking, but in a language that I didn't understand or recognize. It certainly wasn't Portuguese. On top of this mumbling, I suddenly began to hear this terrifying, rasping breathing in and out in a very rhythmic fashion, the sort of rasping that someone with severe breathing difficulty would make. This breathing got louder and louder until it was right behind me, right next to my head, on the pillow, rasping loudly into my right ear. Petrified doesn't even cut it. I was simply frozen with fear. I don't think I could have turned around, even if I had wanted to. This loud, heavy breathing continued for what seemed like a lifetime, but in reality was probably about 30 or 40 seconds, and then it slowly faded away, and the room was left in silence. I laid in the bed for about another hour, unable to sleep, and listening intently for anything else, but there was nothing. Eventually I fell asleep, probably through nervous exhaustion, and when I next woke up it was 6 a.m. and daylight filled the room, and I recall the sheer feeling of relief. The first thing I did was get up and looked at the dining table area, and sure enough, 2 chairs had been moved away from their normal resting positions, and not just by a small amount, but significantly so. I also checked the rest of the communal areas in the villa to see if any doors or windows had been left open, but there was nothing. When my family got up, I told them all about what had happened, and unfortunately I was met with mainly skepticism, which I found a little upsetting at the time. To be honest, I think the experience affected me to the degree where I probably needed to go get counseling to really process it and to help get over it. But of course nothing like that was available at the time. This happened about 2 weeks ago while my brother and his wife were at a party. My own wife and I get called to babysit my nephews and nieces for these sorts of moments by all of my siblings. In this instance, when we were asked to babysit my 5-year-old nephew, his 3-year-old sister, and his 6-month-old brother, we happily obliged. They live in a newish, 10-year-old house, and the only significant location near it is an important cultural site for the local Cree peoples about 10 kilometers away. The hard work was done for us, as the 5- and 3-year-old were asleep upstairs before we arrived. The baby was not fussy but would not sleep, so we were hanging out with him on the main floor. As the night dragged on, around 10:30 I heard a baby crying upstairs. Thinking the 3-year-old must have woken, I left the happy baby with my wife and went to check on our niece. My wife heard the crying as well and asked me to go check. On my way up the flights of stairs, I definitely heard crying from that floor, and I pushed my head into the kids' room to listen. The crying was still going on, but both kids were sound asleep. The sound was coming from across the hall, the nursery, so being quite confused, I moved toward that room. The crying ceased about midway between the door and the crib. Seeing the room was empty, I immediately began trying to explain it to myself. I picked up the baby monitor unit in the room to make sure that it wasn't picking up an errant signal from another house. It was not on, and didn't have a speaker anyways. There were no toys that made that noise around, and no TVs or devices that might play those noises in the room. I stuck around to listen a while longer, but nothing came of it. My wife was baffled and a little spooked, as she had clearly heard the crying as well. Nothing happened the rest of that night, and my nephew is still just the same wonderful kid that he has always been, so I guess no harm, no foul, spooky ghost. My brother and his wife went white when I told them about it at Christmas, but to my knowledge, it is the only thing like that that has ever happened in their house. His house has no history and had also been smudged, so no advice is necessary from anyone. I just thought y'all might appreciate a wholesome, unexplained experience. I was babysitting one night for a family friend about 4 years ago. I had put the kids to bed and crashed on the couch while waiting for my mom and the friend to get back from a night out. Randomly, I woke up and just remember being very confused about why I was even awake. That was, until I heard the front door close. A key thing to note here is the fact that the only sound was the door closing. There was no sound of it being locked, and this lock was very loud. I assumed it was my mom and her friend coming back, so I sat up, preparing to leave. However, I quickly noticed the lack of their voices. They are never quiet after a night out, especially because the friend always has some drinks. And I also noticed that there was only one set of footsteps. For a moment I considered the possibility of it being the friend's husband coming home to grab something. He is a firefighter and was at the station for one of his 24-hour shifts. I could hear the person walking around the front room and then going to the table in there and shuffling through papers as if frantically searching for something. The more I listened, though, the more it just didn't feel right. I pretty quickly dropped the idea of it being the husband and jumped to the idea that it was an intruder. Being around 15 at the time, I was in no way brave enough to confront any intruder that broke into the house. I barely managed to scoot along a wall leading to the front room before becoming completely paralyzed by fear. I ended up promising myself that I would keep my presence hidden until the person walked upstairs to the kids or back toward me. I could hear them pacing around a lot, papers and items being shuffled through. Eventually, I heard the footsteps start to come down the hall before turning into the bathroom, which was before they could reach me or the stairs. Only seconds after the footsteps walked into the bathroom, I heard the front door unlock. This ties back to the beginning because it really stuck out that the door was never locked, and I can remember every single sound from the second that I woke up. Immediately, I heard my mom and the friend talking loudly, and part of me was relieved, while the other part of me was prepared to hear them screaming upon finding an intruder in the bathroom that was too small to hide in. Shockingly, they just walked straight past it, and my mom told me to get my stuff so that we could go home. I was still listening the entire time, and the bathroom door never closed and no further footsteps were heard. As I finally walked down the hall to the door, I scanned the bathroom. The door was wide open, the window was shut and too small to fit anyone but kids through, and there was nobody crouched in the darkness. There was absolutely nothing off about the house. No windows open in any of the first floor, and nobody left between my mom coming back and us leaving. Nothing. I'm a skeptic. I like to think that this may have been an intruder, but I cannot think of any logical way that they could have hid in the short minute that it took for me to walk by, nor did they have an escape route. The friend never found an intruder or noticed any missing items. Nothing makes sense. All I know is that night is vividly ingrained in my mind, too vividly to be a dream, and I still get that feeling of something not being right when I think about it. When I was 13, I fell in love with a guy who said that he was 17. His family was from Haiti. I was a tomboy back then, so I was just excited to have somebody, anybody, like me. We started a romance. I was with him until about 16. He always snuck me around, and I obviously hid him as well. My mom would kill me if she knew that I had a boyfriend at that age. I would cut school and sneak into his house to, well, you know. His grandma, who he lived with, always creeped me out. She was indigenous and wore long, African-looking dresses and hated me. She saw me a few times and would outwardly show, disgust. I never understood why. Fast forward. I was 16. My boyfriend was acting weird. I got suspicious when I received some prank phone calls. I asked to see his phone logs. Long story short, I called some weird numbers and found out that he was having relations with 12 to 13-year-olds. Still, even though he was with me. I was so angry at this point. He was 20-ish. So I went to the police. I don't know why. I just did. They looked him up and down and told me that he wasn't 20. He was actually 27 and had had former charges for statutory rape. They asked me to tell them where he worked. Turns out, he was a pedophile the entire time. No wonder his grandma was disgusted at me. I looked like a child, and she knew his age. He was arrested, and I was asked to testify. This is where the scary stuff happens, by the way, if you've made it this far. 1 week before testifying, I was sleeping in my bed. I had a full-sized bed against the wall. This is important because on the other side of that wall was my mom's room. As a child, I would knock on the wall when I got scared and she would come and rescue me. That night, I was on my back when I woke up with sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I knew because I frantically tried to reach for the wall and couldn't. My limbs felt abnormally heavy and wouldn't budge. I felt serious pressure on my chest, although there was nothing on it. And then I saw it. On my left, standing or kneeling next to me, was what I would call or only describe as a demon. He didn't give me a violent vibe. What was terrifying is it was ominous. Smug even. He looked male, dark skin, almost like a seaweed green. Texture was bumpy, rigid. I just remember extremely sharp features. Pointy nose, pointy head, pointy chin. Very triangular looking. One thing I absolutely cannot forget is the smile. He has an ear-to-ear grin, a confident and perverted smile. I was terrified, unable to scream, and then I felt it. He shoved his disgusting fingers down my throat. This is where it gets almost perverted. It was a vigorous motion. He enjoyed it. It hurt. I closed my eyes and didn't know what else to do but pray. I'm not even religious, and I just prayed and begged for help. I felt the pressure lift off of my body, and my mouth was suddenly clear. I was too scared to move or open my eyes, so I pretended to continue to sleep and ignored the taste of iron in my mouth. I woke up the next morning absolutely mortified. I couldn't speak. My throat felt as if I had swallowed glass. There was blood on my pillow and in my mouth. I ran to my mom. I tried to voice what had happened. She was scared for me, but told me that it was all a dream. I didn't testify. I was scared to speak, and my throat hurt. I was just so stressed with everything, I wanted nothing to do with anybody. He went to jail anyways, because at that point, it was the state against him, not me. Time passed. I grew terrified to sleep alone. I always felt like the demon was in my room. I never saw him again, but I felt his presence everywhere I went. I would sleep facing the door and pray before bed, always. I would hear it in my dreams, sometimes telling me, "I'm still here," mocking me as I would run down the stairs in my dream and my legs would grow heavy. I would try to get out of my house, and I had to fight my body to move in my dream. There was even a time when I was at an ex-boyfriend's house years later, and I was brushing my teeth, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, felt the hairs on my body rise, and I had this insane panic knowing that the demon was there. He was literally hovering on me. I couldn't see him or smell him or anything, but I felt his presence. I ran to my ex's bed and asked him to sleep on top of me the entire night to protect me. I had never in my life broken down like that. I can't explain it. I just knew that the demon was there trying to break in again. So I was about 22 when I got a phone call from the pedophile ex. He found me and called to check on me. Despite him being sick, he did love me in his own way, I think. I don't know. I don't feel like digging into it. Point is, he found me and called. He thanked me for not testifying. He said it saved him more time in jail. I had to ask. I asked him if he knew anything about demons. I then told him what had happened and asked if he could do anything with it because I remember him telling me things about his grandma doing hoodoo. He was silent. Then he finally told me without many details that he didn't exactly know what his grandmother had done, but all he knew was that a few weeks before the trial, she had come to where he was living with another African-looking guy in very indigenous clothing and asked for a few of my things. He gave them my hairbrush with my hair on it and other trinkets that I had left behind. He told me they took it and left. He doesn't know anything else. I was livid. I never spoke to him again and changed my number. I'm 30 now. I'm still scared to sleep alone. I don't feel the demon anymore, however, but I still have PTSD. I am still scared to have the door closed in my room. I still think about it every night before bed. I pray before bed. Although I never saw him again, I still feel something heavy. Not as bad as that time with my ex years ago in the bathroom, but it's more of a subtle heaviness. 3 years ago at my last apartment, which I believe was haunted, I was always so terrified. I would have scary dreams, the type that happen in your bedroom so you're not really sure if it's a dream or if it's real because everything looks the same. I remember having the urge to run out of my apartment sometimes. Just run. I would be on the couch and I would feel that fight or flight feeling and just jet toward the door and stand in the hallway outside my apartment because I was terrified for no reason. Demons exist. I won't get into other small stories that I have now because they're really not major compared to this one. But I will also say, I think I have experienced angels as well. Small stuff like having lost things appear on my bed when I live alone, or being in a dangerous environment and having a sudden feeling of, I need to stop doing this now, after seeing 2 pillars of parallel fog. If there's anything to feel good about, it's believing at least in the theory of opposites. If there's evil, which we know that there is, then there has to be good as well. My mom and I both work at a very old, very haunted hotel. We used to be incredibly open about our haunting experiences, but our current owner is a real jerk who refuses to acknowledge any of it, despite the business that it could bring in. So we no longer put it in the brochures or broadcast it in any way. But I guess it makes it all the more convincing when the guests tell us crazy stories, as they usually have no prior knowledge of the hauntings or even the history of this place. Which is a real shame, because the building has had some serious connections to incredible people who played a major part in founding the country. So a few weeks back, we were in the middle of our January lull. Every year during that month, a lot of us get laid off because we're not needed, so it's pretty quiet around here between the lack of both guests and employees. However, this night we did have 2 guests check in, both of whom were local, and they were celebrating a special occasion as the guy had flowers delivered to the room before they checked in. They went to the restaurant to eat dinner, and then went to their room shortly after 9 p.m. At 10:45 p.m., my mom was startled to see them standing at the front desk with their luggage, looking pale and terrified. They were very reluctant to tell my mom what had happened, but said that they wanted to check out now and not wait until morning. My mom has seen this look on guests' faces before and finally coaxed the truth out of the guy. Apparently, they had went to bed a bit after 10 o'clock, and half an hour later they shot awake to a great crash and the sound of glass breaking. They scrambled out of bed and flipped the light switch on, and could not believe what they saw. The massive, heavy glass lamp on the bedside table had been knocked off onto the floor, where it lay in pieces next to the alarm clock, as though someone had just taken their arm and swept the whole lot off in a rage. After seeing this, the couple grabbed their things and bolted from the room. When they were checking out, they were so embarrassed that they didn't even want a refund and refused my mom's offer to move them to another room, even though it would have been a huge upgrade. The woman just kept saying, "I just want to sleep in my own bed tonight." And the guy told my mom, "We may come back one day, but never again during the month of January when the hotel is nearly empty." My mom apologized as best she could for the craziness and checked them out, and she gave them a refund anyway since they had only used the room for a very short while. When they left, she and a coworker immediately went to view the room and found everything just as they described. While they were marveling at the strangeness of it all, a faint sound nearly scared them to death. It was the woman's cell phone vibrating under the sheets, where she had left it in their frenzy to escape. They grabbed the phone and headed back to the front desk, where they were met by the guy asking to come if they had found it. With his wife in the car waiting, he decided to open up a bit more to my mom about the incident, as his wife was already terrified, and he knew it would only make it worse for her. He said that before they fell asleep, he had an undeniable sense of dread, as if something were going to happen. And when the sound first woke him up, he looked toward the foot of the bed and saw the silhouette of his wife standing there. He asked if she was okay, and heard her voice answer right next to him. She was still in the bed. We've had people hear voices in music, see apparitions, and capture incredible images on camera, one of which was a young man dressed in colonial-era clothing, and you can see him clearly down to his hair and belt. But for someone or something to sweep a lamp and clock off of a table so hard that it breaks the lamp is very unusual. Our phenomena is very rarely of the physical variety, so I am not sure what to make of this. I myself have never been frightened of whatever is here, maybe because I'm a history lover and would almost welcome the prospect of seeing someone from such a long-gone era. As to who the woman was that this guy saw at the foot of his bed, I have no clue. We have a very well-known female spirit in the hotel, supposedly from the era when it was a Civil War hospital, but the building also served as an elite college for women and of course was a home when it was first built. It could have been anyone for all we know. This paranormal encounter took place at the hotel I worked at last year. I was 20 years old, working at a small mom-and-pop hotel in Ontario, California. I had worked there for some time before I started to stay there for a few months. The owner taught me everything that I needed to know so that I can run his business while he went on a business trip to Africa. Mind you, I didn't have a car, so my only option was to stay there and work around the clock if need be. I didn't have to pay for the room, and I got to wash my clothes in the laundry room. There was a grocery store in walking distance, and restaurants all around me where I could get food at a discounted price since I worked at the hotel. I thought this was a sweet deal. One night, my boyfriend came down to visit, and while he was in the bathroom, I heard banging coming from the room next to ours. Then, I heard scratching on my walls. I told him to stop playing, and he didn't even know what I was talking about. The banging continued all night, so I called the front desk and told them that the people next to me were loud and that I had to be up at 6 to go down there to work. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me that she hadn't rented out the room next to mine. Mind you, I had an end room. I quickly ran outside to see if the curtains were open or closed, and they were open. I could see right into that room, and no one was there. I had never been so creeped out in all my life. I decided to sage the room to get rid of any bad spirits or energy, and that worked for a while, until it didn't. The next time, something demonic happened. I was asleep and kept hearing whispers in my sleep. I hate whispers with a passion, and they creep me out to the fullest. So I sat up in bed and I was looking around the dark room, and in the corner of the room, I saw white, glowing eyes staring at me. I felt frozen by its glare. I could see its body and saw that it was crouched down, holding its knees. Then I saw more shadows appearing closer and closer. I went to turn on the lamp next to the bed, and it didn't cut on. So my next thought was that I needed to run outside and get to safety. It took all the balls in the world for me to get up and do that. I was so scared that I couldn't even feel my legs. All I could feel was the cold wooden floor beneath me. I got to the door and flung it open, only to see that the bedroom curtains were on the outside of my room's window. The sky was black, and the clouds were a dark green with gray tint. I was mortified to realize that I was still asleep, and that I hadn't actually woken up. I looked back inside the hotel room and saw myself asleep in the bed. I screamed bloody murder, and that's when I jolted awake for real. I said a prayer and went back to sleep. The encounter that followed was even worse. Yet again I could hear things in my sleep. I was terrified and couldn't move any part of my body. I began to pray in my head as loud as I could, only to wake and feel my body slam on the bed as if I had been levitating. I called my grandma the next day, and she said that it was a demonic attack. I got my car shortly after, a few days later, and never stayed in that hotel again. In June of 2016, my mother died of cancer. 5 of my 6 siblings and I were fortunate enough to make the trip to the small town of Harper, Texas, to be with her in her final days. If you've ever been to Harper or have driven through, you know that there's not much to it. With a population just shy of 1,100 people, 1 restaurant, and 1 stoplight, it could be more accurately described as a rest stop along US Highway 290. To keep my sanity during the trip, rather than stay in my mother's tiny and now very overcrowded house, I opted to stay at a hotel in nearby Fredericksburg, about 25 miles away. For the next 2 weeks, I made the drive daily to spend time with my family, making the most of that time that we had left with our mother. One by one, my siblings and I eventually had to return to our normal lives, although 1 brother and sister would stay with our mother until she passed. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, leaving my mother and knowing full well that I would not get to see her again in this plane of existence. I had a very early morning check-in time for my car rental and flight back to California. Since I would need to get up at 3 a.m. to drive the 85 miles to San Antonio, I felt it prudent to get back to my hotel in Fredericksburg and try to get some sleep before departure. Sleep did not come easily. Although I was tired and emotionally drained, it was still very early in the evening. After what seemed like an eternity of tossing and turning, I finally managed to doze off and slept for a few hours, until it happened. I awoke suddenly and opened my eyes wide, but did not try to move from the position in which I lay. I felt an unmistakable presence with me in the room, like someone had been standing in front of my bed and watching me. I slowly peeled back the comforter from my head, and still trying not to move, mustered whatever courage I had at that moment, and looked. At the foot of the bed, I saw a dark silhouette appearing to just stand there. Considering my emotional state at that moment, I quite literally said out loud, "Oh hell no," and just pulled the comforter back over my head, knowing the next time I looked, whatever it was I thought I saw standing there would be gone. What happened next was one of those moments that stay with you for a lifetime. As I lay there with my head covered, I held my breath momentarily and just listened. Seconds later, I felt someone sitting down on the foot of the bed. I could feel the bed shift slightly, and the weight of the comforter on my legs got significantly heavier. I remember being upright at that moment, throwing the covers off of me and saying, nope, no way." I got out of bed and now paced the floor, trying to both calm and reassure myself that I was in fact the only one in the room. I looked at the clock and saw that it was just after midnight, and then made the obvious choice that I would stay awake for the next few hours before checking out of the hotel and driving to the airport. I opened the mini fridge and found an energy drink, then turned on the TV and texted my wife about what I had just experienced. At 3 a.m., I was at the hotel front desk to check out and settle my bill. The night auditor was a very nice young lady who had greeted me with a smile, commented on my very early departure, and asked if I had gotten enough sleep. I shook my head and proceeded to tell her what had happened to me in my room earlier that night, still a little freaked out. Her expression now more serious, the auditor leaned forward and said in a lowered tone that she knew that the hotel was haunted. In the dead of night, she would hear children running up and down the hall, look, but see no one there. Chairs would slide across the floor in the nearby dining room, making an unmistakable sound she said she heard quite often. I paid my bill, thanked her for sharing her experiences in the haunted hotel, and was soon on the highway driving to the airport, homeward bound. I have experienced many paranormal occurrences at my own home, but never while traveling. At the time of this story, I was a 16-year-old high school student. I got a babysitting job for a couple who had a family wedding and needed a babysitter for a super late night. I was referred to them by another family that I used to sit for. Keep in mind, this was when cell phones were just coming out, so I had a really crappy flip phone with a certain amount of minutes. There were 3 kids. The oldest was a boy about 8, the middle boy was about 6, and there was a little girl who was a toddler in diapers and couldn't speak. I came in while the sun was still up to meet the kids while the parents were still there. The parents were so cool. They showed me where all the snacks were and gave me the ground rules for the night. Kids in bed by 7:30, teeth brushed, you know the drill. Once they left, we started eating dinner. To my shock, the middle child, who we'll call Teddy, kept throwing his fork hard at his siblings and pinching his sister with his nails under the table. He kept kicking my shins and throwing his food around the room. The moment his parents left, he became a terror. Their house was old but remodeled, so their toys were in the basement playroom. After dinner, we all went in there to play. As soon as we went down the stairs, it felt wrong. Don't get it twisted. It was a beautiful finished basement with a couch, flat screen, and toys, but something just felt creepy about it. Then the little girl kept pointing at a blank wall, one with no pictures or anything on it, and kept screaming at the top of her lungs and crying. It really unnerved me. At this point, I'm getting a terrible, really bad feeling. So I say, let's go upstairs and watch TV till bedtime. The kids seem to love that idea. So I carry the little girl upstairs and turn on the TV for the 3 of them and then go back down to grab her favorite stuffed dog and clean up a bit. When I turn around to walk upstairs, I see Teddy smiling a sickening smile at the top of the stairs. He has his hands on the light switch. My stomach dropped. I didn't have my phone or a light, and if this little shit locks me down here, I thought. The light switch is at the top of the stairs outside the stairway, so if he closed the door, I was screwed. And sure enough, he flicked off the lights, cackled, and went to slam the door and lock me in the dark basement. I have never moved so fast in my existence. I flew up the stairs and shoved my hand into the door to keep him from locking me down there. I asked him why he did that and yelled at him to never do that again. All he did was smile at me and then slowly walk away, giggling. I iced my hand and watched him closely for the rest of the night. Bedtime comes around, and I put the kids to bed upstairs without any problems. There were 3 bedrooms, the parents' room at the end of the long hall, then the baby girl's room in the middle, and the boys shared a room with the bunk bed at the end of the hall by the top of the stairs. Everything finally seemed quiet, and I began to forget the horrors from earlier and started watching TV. About an hour after I put her down, the baby girl started screaming through the baby monitor. A scream that sounded like she was in pain. Thinking her brother Teddy was bothering her, I ran upstairs to stop him. As soon as I get to the top of the stairs, I see him laying down on his bed facing the wall. The baby is hysterical and is again pointing at nothing and crying. I am freaked out by now. I rock the baby back to sleep, check on the boys, then return to the living room. What the hell is happening? Am I imagining things? I shake it off and turn the TV back on. This is when the night goes from bad to a total nightmare. Once back in the living room, I start to hear screaming every couple minutes. What sounds this time like a grown man screaming in pain. At first I thought it was outside or maybe a TV or a radio, so I ignored it and kept watching television. But soon it became clear that it wasn't a joke and it wasn't my imagination. It was coming from inside the house. Then I hear what sounds like little feet running upstairs in the hallway. For a second, I'm not scared anymore. I'm angry that Teddy's out of bed 2+ hours after bedtime. I go to the bottom of the stairs and holler up Teddy's name and tell him to go back to sleep. I don't hear a response, but I do hear the footsteps continue. Then I hear what I think is him run into his parents' room at the other end of the hall. Feet pounding down the hallway, clear as day. So I sprint up there, thinking I've caught him in the act. The hall is empty and dark. I turn, and I find Teddy is sitting up in his bed. He's staring at me again with that sickening smile. I could see his brother was asleep on the top bunk, and I could see that his baby sister was asleep on the monitor in my hand. He gave me the creeps. I told him to lay back down. I go back downstairs to the middle floor. I then hear someone walking up from the basement, and I lost it. I slammed and locked the basement door, and I called my house number. My big brother answers, and I tell him that I'm scared. He puts me on speaker, and I explain everything to my family. I babysit every weekend, and I've never had a negative experience or called them like this, so luckily they believed me. My grandpa, being a super religious man, prayed with me and calmed me down. My big brother got into his car and came to sit with me until the parents got home, but the town I was in was a bit of a drive, so he told me he'd be there in 40 minutes. Even after we hung up, I could hear the footsteps running around the house. I am not a religious person, but I sat on the couch and prayed and cried. I have never been so scared in my life. I was terrified. The parents came home before my brother got there, and they saw that I had been crying. They asked what happened, and I told them everything non-supernatural that occurred because I didn't want them to think I was a crazy person or tell people not to hire me. I just wasn't going to mention it at all. So I just said Teddy was a handful, and that was it. As I was leaving, the dad, in a deadly serious voice, said, "Did the ghost bother you?" I slowly turned to him, not fully believing what I had just heard. I asked him if he was being serious. He said, "Oh, I'm being serious. We've had a ghost problem for a while now. Did you experience anything yourself?" I broke down and started crying when I gave them an honest recap of the night. I told them about the screams that I heard, the footsteps, everything. How the baby was crying at the wall and how Teddy tried locking me in the basement. They believed me right away. The parents said they'd moved into the house about 2 years ago after the old man who built the house died inside of it. He was an actual hoarder and fell and injured himself in the basement and died among his piles. Since no one could hear him scream, they didn't find him in time. By all accounts from the neighborhood, he was a mean recluse of a man. Either way, what a terrible way to go. They said they would wake up every night to things flying off of their kitchen counters and doors slamming. They would hear knocks and pounding in the walls. I was shocked. I asked why they stayed in the house if they knew it was haunted. They explained they weren't able to move due to their jobs and current financial situation. I have to admit that although it wasn't huge, it was a beautifully built home. That old construction kind of home with bookshelves built into the walls and a winding grand staircase. The dad said he would go downstairs every night for a year and say, "Go away. This is our home now. You aren't welcome here," over and over. He said eventually the activity stopped. They said it only sparked up when someone new would stay in the house or when they'd have a sitter at night. They said since I quote-unquote knew the truth now, they would pay me extra to come back because they could never keep a babysitter. Pfft. Yeah, right, I thought. I am never going back there. But I said I'd be in touch, and I ran out of that house. I am ashamed to say that I never answered their calls again. I felt bad, but there was no way in hell I'd ever return there. I still babysit once in a while, and I've never had any experience like that since. I still think of those kids sometimes, and I really think that Teddy was being affected by the spirit there. I've never encountered a child so cruel, so negative. Thinking of his creepy little smile still sends a chill down my back. I hope they were able to move or clear the negative energy. Either way, it's one night I won't forget. Here is the chilling tale of one of my stepmoms, who we'll call Lisa here, experiences with ghosts that she has conjured through her old Ouija board. So Lisa had just divorced her ex-husband and was living alone in a new house with her 2 kids. She moved to get away from the torturous spirits or demons in her old house. She was settling down with a broken heart and a new life. She went to bed after forgetting to pray one night. She did this because it was what the priest told her to do to solve her problems with the paranormal. It seemed to work, she told me, but when I didn't do it, it would all come back. Lisa had no paranormal experiences while she was in that house. Until now. On the night she didn't pray. Her oldest kid was 7 and now sleeping alone. Her youngest was 3, and Lisa kept her sleeping in her room because she felt like she had to keep an eye on her. Because of all the experiences, she was a worrywart. Anyway, she falls asleep and wakes up to 3 knocks. She knows this all too well. She lit a sage, prayed, and went back to sleep. This didn't work. That night she kept hearing scratches on her wall above her head. She turns to look up and sees a face in the pitch black dark. Lisa just woke up and thought it was her imagination. But then came a feeling of impending doom. A feeling also that she knew too well. She turns on her lamp, turns around to see a black mist looming next to her bed. She grabs her daughter who is sleeping with her and grabs a Bible. She screams for the mist to go away and everything calms down. She flicks on the light, paces around the room, and looks over to where she heard the scratching sounds earlier. To her horror, she sees 3 scratch marks the size of tiger claws above her bed on the wall. The scratches were on her wall until she put up new wallpaper. I asked her stepdaughters. One of them remembers her mom screaming at a wall. She never saw what my stepmom saw, but they wondered why they saw the scratch marks. So before some of y'all say I'm making this up, it's not my responsibility to prove it. To begin with, I should explain some basic personal history. Real names will not be revealed, obviously. I have a family of 5 plus 2 spouses. My parents, my 2 brothers, my oldest brother's wife, and mine. Before getting married and moving out with my wife, I lived in the same house for 19 years. My parents bought it when I was like 6 months old, and I got married during college, so I've only ever known that house and my current apartment. I had some traumatic experiences when I was very young that are tied to one of the rooms in my parents' house, and then a few years later my parents had me move into that room. During my time in that room, I started having vicious nightmares, all involving me watching helplessly as the people that I loved were brutally murdered in graphic and creative ways, in which one constant fixture was a figure that seemed to be observing everything and watching me from a distance, never directly interacting with the chaos, but always on the edge of my vision. This figure always looked the same. A tall mass of complete opaque blackness, with the exception of an antlered animal skull where its head should be. Anyway, when I went to college, moving out of that room, the nightmares stopped completely. I didn't have a single one until I came home for winter break and stayed in that room again. During that break, my then fiancé stayed a few nights at my house with me. We slept in separate rooms, but both on the same floor. During the night, she texted me that she was having a panic attack and that she thought she was seeing a figure. When I asked what it looked like, she described the figure from my dreams exactly, and I told her to start reading Psalms in the hopes that it might help. She immediately felt better. Not sure if it was because of the scripture itself or if it was just a placebo, but I am a firm Christian, so I believe that it helped. We talked for a while about it before deciding to keep an eye out for more spooky shit. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. The next morning, I felt numb and out of commission, and I didn't fully recover until the next day. Every time I've gone back to that house since, I have felt an overwhelming, malicious presence there. It has the effect of weighing down on everything. It kind of feels like cotton in your ears, and making everything feel super depressing. Recently there was another development. My grandfather passed away this last semester, and my grandmother moved into the house with my parents. She's a troubled person, and she brought a lot of toxicity and conflict to the home. Last time I was there with my wife, we immediately felt something horrifyingly evil. I've always had a sensitivity to spiritual things, and it was like nothing that I have felt before. I think that it was feeding off of the conflict in the house and making things worse. My cat, who we had brought with us, immediately slipped into what looked like a super depressive state. She wouldn't play or do anything, no matter how hard we tried. The kicker was the time that I decided to try something. I walked into my old room, the one tied to my traumatic experiences, and tried to feel for any sort of extra bad energy. It was tangible. My mom and I had repainted that room the last time I was down there, and it felt very cathartic, but the power was still ever present. On an instinct, I touched a wall in the room and immediately had violent visions reliving my trauma, except the spirit was there, watching and seemingly gloating. It felt like it was trying to rub what had happened in my face like a "look what I'm capable of" sort of thing. My wife told me that I went white as a sheet and began shaking and crying, but I don't remember it. It behooves me here to add that I have seen several therapists about my traumatic experience. I don't think it was a PTSD flashback, as I've mostly worked through everything and am pretty mentally stable now. I'm relatively certain that the presence in my childhood home is evil, even demonic. I've talked to my mom, and I get the sense that she doesn't really believe me, but my wife and I are pretty certain of it. In the fall of 2019, I started babysitting for a new family. They live in a house built in the 1920s. I've always believed in angels and demons, not necessarily just ghosts. One of the first times that I was babysitting the 3-year-old and the 1-year-old, I was putting them to bed and I thought that I heard someone knocking on their front door downstairs. I looked out the window to see if the parents were home, but there was no one there. I decided to just ignore it. Another time, again, I was putting them to bed, and I heard what sounded like a man and a woman having a conversation in the kitchen. Again, I looked to see if the parents had just gotten home. They hadn't. Another time, I was watching them during the day when the mom was out of town and the dad was at work. I expected him home around 3:30. The girls were napping upstairs, and I heard the kitchen door open and footsteps. I was surprised the dad was back so early. As I turned the corner to go and greet him in the kitchen, I saw what I thought was him, black suit and all, walk past the door frame. I entered the kitchen and started to say, "Didn't expect you back so early," but there was no one there. The last time I ever babysat them, I was playing in the backyard with the girls. Let me remind you that the oldest one is 3. She is constantly scared to be alone or in the dark, which I thought was strange because usually at such a young age, kids haven't had any experiences to make them this frightened. She said to me that day, "I saw Slender Man in my bathroom mirror, and he waved back at me." I was terrified. I asked her to repeat what she had just said multiple times. Slender Man. She is 3. There's no reason for her to already know what that means. At that moment, I realized that I had always closed her bathroom door just because it felt creepy. And when I would come back to the room later, the door was always opened. I've never babysat for them again. This experience I had dates back to the second house that I lived in. When I was about 13, my nan moved in with us following my granddad's death, and with the sale of the 2 houses, we managed to move into a fairly big house with a massive garden. Just to put it into perspective, our neighbor's garden in a house in a previous time was a small tennis club with 3 courts, and wrapped around the back of our garden, just to give a perspective of the size of these gardens. So anyway, my bedroom was sort of attached, and above the garage to the side of the house, so I used to be able to see across my neighbor's garden and the gardens next door to theirs, whilst also being sort of detached from the rest of the house. We lived there for about 5 years, and nothing really happened. I went to uni and had some experiences which I've posted on another post. When I returned from uni, I picked up the dirty habit of smoking and not wanting my parents to know. I used to climb out of my window on the side of the roof of a shelter that we had outside my window and sit to smoke. When I was back for the summer after my first year, I was on this roof and I heard our neighbor's dog bark and go ballistic. He wasn't in the garden, but obviously by their back door. At the same time, their automatic backlight sensor switched the light on, and clear as day there was a black, and I mean really black, figure in their garden. It stood maybe around 5'10". Looked like a man's figure. It was just pacing up and down their decking, almost right below me. I initially crapped myself, thinking it was the husband and that for sure he had seen me smoking. I looked closer, frozen still. What I was seeing was almost hovering, gliding, effortless, not walking. Suddenly their back door opened, and the husband came out with the dog, and just like that, it vanished. I continued to see Steve out there, and the exact same routine occurred. That was almost every other night. I even kept a log at the time, looking for some sort of pattern. One night shortly after, about 8 weeks, my parents had a barbecue and my neighbors came. I brought this up with the gentleman's wife, who looked at me and laughed. She proceeded to tell me that the shadow's name was Steve. Steve had been in their house for the last 20 years, and she regularly sees him pacing the garden, walking down the stairs, opening and closing doors and cupboards, moving their possessions, almost like living as if they were not there. Her kids had seen him and grown up with him, but her husband had never, ever seen him. I was shook, but glad at the same time that I wasn't going crazy. I continued to see Steve right up until we moved out of the house a few years ago. If anything, I felt sad for him. It was almost as if he was unable to move on. I live in a small town, and things like rumors tend to spread pretty quickly since folks around here are incredibly nosy beings. The most trusted source of these rumors is the local bar located in the center of the small settlement that we live in, which my father visits frequently. It is right by the school that I go to. Anyway, 2 weeks before all this bullcrap started, he came back with quite the story. It is said that something off has been going on with our town's graveyard, which is right by these creepy old woods a little bit away from the town itself. Usually takes 20 minutes to get there by car. Apparently, drunkards there claim that there's a medium disguised as a homeless man hanging around the woods surrounding the graveyard, and that sometimes he can even be found by the graves eating bread. At first I didn't believe it, so me and my friend decided to walk to the graveyard and hang around there trying to find that guy. So we did, and the graveyard was full of people for a few hours, but the normal kind of people. A few more hours passed, and soon there was no one left except for an old, bearded man on the bench by the football field across the woods in the parking lot. He was looking at empty plastic bags with a box of cigarettes resting beside him. Nothing suspicious. My friend had the guts to walk up to him and insult him. I walked away from her, but when she crossed the line, I pulled her away, telling her that he may be a serial killer or a crazy drug addict. But he remained quiet until she yanked her hand away from mine, grabbed his box of cigarettes, and crushed it under her feet. She also threatened to hurt him if he didn't speak, and that's when he stood up and looked her dead in the eyes, and he was much taller than her too. He told her something along the lines of, "You are a disgrace in the eyes of God," and walked away onto the road until we lost track of him. I started to worry, and told her that maybe he was a priest or a monk, and now was going to tell everyone in our town how she had mocked him, and I was actually afraid. She reassured me that he was none of these things, because he had cigarettes with him, but I think those weren't even his. That night I slept over at her house because I was scared to go back to mine alone. I woke up in the middle of the night, and since I was sleeping in the same bed with her, I had a clear view of the pitch-black shadow of a man standing over her right beside her bed, his palm on her wrist. I raised my body, getting ready to stand up, but he turned his head to me and started to shake it from left to right. So I figured it was a lucid dream and rolled over to the other side, drifting back to sleep. The next morning, she looked pale and ghostly, and I asked her if she got enough rest. She informed me that she did not even sleep, and kept having problems with her breathing and her heartbeat. I was so scared that I almost pissed myself right there and then, and as of now, I am home alone and feeling like I am being watched. There was one time I was staying at a hotel in Madrid, not too far from the airport, and by the time my buddy and I arrived there, it was 11 p.m. I had completely messed up the booking information because I forgot that we were losing a day by traveling from California. Since my buddy and I had arrived to the hotel so late, we were exhausted. Still, we were given our room number, a card, and sent up to our room. I noticed that the more turns we made down a hallway, the less lights worked. By the time we reached our room door, it was dark and scary. I didn't want to say anything, implying that I was feeling uneasy about the room because I was 24 at the time, so I had to be tough. And my buddy was 27. Once we opened the door, the room was bright and looked very modern. I felt a whole lot better upon entry. The room was supposed to have 2 full-size beds, but for some reason they were pushed together to make a giant bed. My buddy and I agreed it wasn't a big deal, just to stay on our sides of it and deal with it until tomorrow when we weren't so tired. I slept on the left, and he slept on the right. Sometime between 1 and 4 a.m., when it was very dark in the room, I woke up and saw a man standing in the corner. I knew for sure that the man wasn't my friend. My buddy Cody is 6'2", 195 pounds. The guy standing in the corner looked about 5'10", 180. This was the first and only time I ever experienced sleep paralysis. I remember staring at the guy, who appeared to have his back to me, facing the corner of the room closest to me, as if he was counting for a game of hide-and-seek. I stared at my arm hanging off the bed to the left, and focused all of my energy and strength to move it, but I could not. I tried to scream for Cody to wake up so that at least he would know of the man in our room, but no sound would come out of my mouth. I've never panicked so hard in my life, and before I knew it, my eyes closed, and I was unconscious again. It wasn't until 7:30 a.m. that I woke up and screamed Cody's name and hit him. It was as if everything I tried to do during the night suddenly came out all at once. He woke up startled, of course, as I came to the realization that everything was okay. The order of everything I'm about to say next is how I knew that there was a ghost in that room. I told Cody, dude, I just freaked out. It's just that last night, and before I was able to finish my sentence, Cody said, "Did you see that guy in the corner?" My jaw dropped as he told me he experienced the exact same thing as I had the night before. He had sleep paralysis and couldn't move as he stared at that man. We had all of our belongings still, and nothing was changed about the room. It still scares me when I think about it until this day. How we could never explain what happened that night, or how we both experienced the same thing. Cody ended up experiencing another ghost in a hostel that we stayed at one time. But as for me, that was the only ghost experience I ever had while traveling. I've been a babysitter a bunch of times. Sometimes I take care of the kids of my mom's friends, other times I take care of my little cousins. I really liked to babysit all of my kids, because it usually went smoothly and none of them were problematic to deal with. One time I was babysitting my little cousins, who at the time were 6, 4, 2, and 5 months old. My aunt told me that the baby monitor needed new batteries, so I decided to just check on the baby from time to time. The night went as usual. The bigger kids ate dinner, played a bit, then watched some cartoons, and fell asleep a few minutes after. I was downstairs just texting with some friends and tried to listen carefully in case my baby cousin made any sounds. For most of the night, I thought I heard the baby making sounds, so I kept going in there and checking on him. I believed it was just my mind playing tricks on me, probably because I was on high alert, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the 2-year-old woke up crying because of a nightmare, so I grabbed him and let him lay on my chest until he fell asleep, and then I tucked him into bed again. A few minutes passed, and I heard the baby screaming, so I ran upstairs and did what I could to calm him down so that the other kids wouldn't wake up. As soon as I get to the door, the screaming stops, and when I entered the bedroom to check on him, he was sound asleep. I freaked out and checked everything in the nursery, hoping to find some kind of toy with a similar sound, but there was nothing. I immediately went and checked on the other kids, praying that they were okay. Fortunately, all 4 kids were asleep, and it appeared to have not disturbed anyone. Still, I made sure everything was all right, and that nothing had actually made a sound. I was kind of surprised that the scream hadn't woken any of the other kids up, but at the same time I was thankful for it, because I didn't want the other kids to be scared in their own house, and also I wouldn't know how to explain what had happened to my aunt and uncle without freaking them out. I didn't hear any other sounds for the rest of the night until my aunt and uncle came home. I decided to not say anything, and just take the money and go home. This happened 30 years ago when I was about 13, 14 years old, and me and an older friend were babysitting for a 6-year-old girl and her younger brother. We had been told that sometimes the girl complains about seeing a ghost man in her bedroom and upstairs at night, and that he comes out through the attic door. Now, I didn't believe a word of it. Kids are weird and say weird things. We get the kids ready for bed, but they wouldn't settle. The girl said that she felt scared, and her little brother started crying. She asked if she could sleep in her mom's bed until she got home. The little brother wanted to go with her. So I tucked them in and told some silly stories and laughed until they were both tired. Both kids were virtually asleep when we left, door ajar, hall light on. An hour later, we're sitting downstairs watching The Equalizer, and all was good. Kids were definitely asleep, as I had to sneak past their room to use the bathroom. I had a quick peek on my way back, and aside from the little brother snoring a bit, everything else was quiet. I go back downstairs, and we watch TV a bit more. About 20 minutes go by, and out of nowhere we hear banging. Heavy, heavy banging, and the kids are screaming immediately. I run up the stairs, and meet the kids as they're running out of the room. More banging, and this time I have eyes on the kids, so I know that they're not making the noise. The kids fly at me. I grab the little brother, and we rush downstairs into the front room, shut the door, and all crash onto the sofa. Everything is silent apart from the TV, which I switch off. We sit in silence for about 5 minutes, just sort of holding each other. After a bit, the girl, with tears in her eyes, just says in a matter-of-fact way, the man was angry because she wasn't in her own room, so he tried to push over a wardrobe, and then he started thumping the wall. This event has stayed with me all these years. In 1996-97, I lived in a fairly old terraced house with a cemetery at the end of a road. Cliché, I know, but it's an important detail. Nothing remarkable about the house or the area, it was just convenient for college. Anyway, I was up late one night on the PC in my bedroom, which looked out onto the street. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. For whatever reason, probably to give my eyes a rest, I wandered over to the window and looked down at the road in the direction of the cemetery, although it was too far down the street for me to actually see. And I saw 3 people walking slowly down the road. I could see that they were quite old and appeared to be dressed in funeral clothes, which, given the hour, was weird. There were 2 women and a man. I put their ages at about 80, and the woman in the middle was being steadied or guided by the other woman and the man as they came closer. I got the impression that she was upset. My first thought was that given their age, she had recently buried her husband and grief had caused her to behave slightly irrationally. It was all interesting enough for me to carry on watching as they got closer to the house. Just outside the front door of the house was a street lamp. I continued to watch them as they made their way past, but when they got to the lamppost, they all stopped, and the upset woman in the middle looked up at me and grinned. This is where it got even weirder. The grin became a sort of grimace, and if there was any color in her face to start with, it was now dead white. At that point, I realized that I was staring right into her eyes, but her eyes were pitch black. If you've ever crashed a car, the final split second before you make impact seems to drag out as you process more information than normal in the time frame. It was that sort of scenario. I'm sure that we only made eye contact for a second, but it felt like several minutes as my peripheral vision faded, and I felt like all I could see were those two black holes in her face drawing me in. The distance between us didn't change, but somehow it felt like she was coming closer. At that point, the two people with her were just continuing to look down the road as if they were frozen, but waiting for this woman to finish with whatever she was doing. I was suddenly hit with this intense feeling of dread and panic, so I threw myself to the floor. As soon as I had broken away from her gaze, I felt pretty stupid that this upset old woman, who clearly needed help, had spooked me so badly. I looked out the window again, and there was no sign of them. Not entirely my story, but the main event happened to my mom when she lived at home with my grandparents. Back when she was a teen, they had a beagle that would often stare down the hallway and growl at nothing, the whole deal. In the middle of the night while lying in bed, my mom heard the dog begin to growl just before she felt someone grab her by the ankles and begin to yank her out of her bed. She says she was halfway pulled onto the carpet before she started saying the Lord's Prayer and the hands let go of her. But her dog was still going absolutely nuts. There have been other little things that have happened there too involving other people in my family. No one seems immensely worried about it, but I've always had the feeling of being watched in that house, even before knowing some of the stories I've heard now that I'm older. It's always the same one. My grandparents have lived in it since it was built when they were first married, so no bad history of the house itself, but perhaps the land that it's on? My grandma has told us stories about seeing shadow figures walking down the hall. My brother smelled my grandpa's cigar smoke in the kitchen during a family event. My grandpa had passed away a couple of years ago. Used to always smoke a certain brand of cigar outside on the back porch. And I once was startled by a loud, raspy cough right behind me while I sat in the empty house playing computer games with the speakers off. Recently, my mom and I had installed some cameras in the basement and on the front and back porches, just for extra security. I'm dreading the day my grandma tells us one of them caught something, and I'll have to see it with my own eyes. I work in a prison in the UK. I always like to work nights because you do 7 days on and 7 days off. While on nights, I got locked onto a wing with no keys. We have a sealed pouch with a cell key inside for emergencies, if someone is hanging and I need to cut them down, etc., that kind of thing. I'm in charge of looking after 200 plus prisoners. After a few busy hours answering cell bells and doing my checks on people who are essentially on suicide watch, the wing starts to settle down. The stories I'm including here are very small portions of things that have happened to me on night shifts. Story 1. One night I was doing my checks. I heard a loud bang coming from the ones landing outside the servery. When I went inside to investigate, there was a broom on the floor. When I reviewed the CCTV footage, you can clearly see the broom slowly being lifted away from the wall where it was resting, and then quickly getting thrown to the ground. We have the footage copied, and most of the people at work have seen it. We usually show it to new staff before they do their first night shift to freak them out. Story 2. One night we had someone overdose. I was working the week after all this happened, and the cell was locked off for the police investigation and was completely empty. At about 3:30 in the morning, the cell bell for that room was pressed. At first I didn't even know that this cell belonged to the guy that had died the previous week, but as soon as I looked into the empty cell, I realized, and just froze. Takes a lot to freak me out, but I didn't walk back on that part of the landing until roll count. Story 3. This one is more minor, but still equally as creepy. Things that happened just last week that prompted me to share this. While walking on the 3's landing, one of the showers on the 2's turned on by itself. The only way to turn it on is to press a button on the wall inside the shower. I went to investigate, and the showers were locked, and the lights inside were turned off. This was about 2:30 a.m. Approximately 30 minutes later, I was walking down the 2's landing and an office door slammed shut. I checked the landings for open windows, and they were all shut. Again, every time I hear a noise, I always investigate, and love anything creepy, but this sent shivers down my spine.
Back in October, I decided to treat my girlfriend to a night away at a popular British seaside town. The town is one of those historical areas, which has its fair share of ghost legends and gothic tourism, so there was lots of touristy attractions such as ghost walks, which me and my girlfriend decided to go on. A bit of background information about the hotel. It is regarded as one of the oldest hotels in the town and is also a popular tavern among the locals. The inn itself had a rather creepy feel to it, but our room was modern and comfortable. The last place you'd imagine paranormal activity to occur. We set off on the ghost walk with a local guide who knew about the paranormal hotspots. Unexpectedly at the time, we stopped directly outside our hotel. "This is the most haunted hotel in town. Good luck if you're staying here," he cackled. He proceeded to tell us that there was a number of spirits that haunted the building, and guests frequently experienced sightings and unexpected things. However, at the time, we were a bit drunk from dinner, and we brushed off the walk as your typical tourist trap. We went to bed without any issues at all. I woke up later that night, paralyzed, and with a sense of unease. I felt what I would describe as a strong, cold gale blowing around the room. Imagine being outside in strong, windy weather. The sensation lasted for, I would say, about 15 seconds when it suddenly stopped and the room filled with a warm, relaxed sensation once again. I woke my girlfriend to tell her, and she brushed it off, saying it was probably sleep paralysis and a draft, so I believed her and went back to sleep. I thought nothing of it until we checked out. The receptionist asked us how our stay was and if there had been any issues. Everything was perfect, but there was a really big draft in the room, I exclaimed, as you would. Surprisingly, she casually laughed. "No, that's not a draft. It's just a spiritual presence in the room. It happens all the time in that one," she casually reassured us. Now I'm really interested in the paranormal, so I asked about the stuff in the hotel. She told us that everything the guy told us on the walk was indeed true, and the spirits are those of old landlords and locals whom help run the hotel and keep the guests safe. She told me lots of stories of how guests would stumble on the stairs and be caught by an unseen presence, as well as children's lost toys showing up right at the moment where they're about to start crying. She even told us that one of the past landlady's spirits acts as a bouncer, causing troublemaking and aggressive guests to feel ill enough to leave. The receptionist seemed really happy, and was used to the paranormal activity in the hotel, and says that she regularly sleeps alone in the rooms without any worry. Obviously, this isn't that much of a scary ghost story, but more of an interesting experience. I would definitely go back for another stay in that hotel.
In October of 2018, I was hospitalized for 4 nights. I was put in the surgical wing due to lack of beds, and was in a 4-person room with all rooms near me having 4 people as well. The last night of my stay was on the 31st, which of course was Halloween. Other than it being noisy from the firecrackers outside, followed by the heavy rain, it was uneventful. I was particularly restless that night and not having an easy time falling asleep. Just before midnight, and I remember looking at the clock seeing 11:47 because I couldn't fall asleep. I saw a figure in the window next to my bed. It was a massive black dog, like a long-haired husky with the reddest eyes that I have ever seen. It was such a deep, but at the same time bright crimson. It was just staring at me, and I felt completely frozen. I turned over and covered my face, and when I looked over some time later, it was gone. I should note that I was on an upper floor with a roof landing outside my window, so no way could an animal have gotten up there. I ignored it, called the nurse, and asked for something to help me sleep. They told me I didn't need anything and would eventually sleep on my own. About half an hour later, I saw the same creature staring at me from inside a window within the hospital across from mine. I immediately felt sick and panicked, and as quick as I saw it, it was gone. Several minutes later, my wing went on lockdown. The doors all closed, and all I could hear were screams and nurses running. The screams and panic went on for 4 hours. I found out the next morning that a pregnant woman in the room next to mine had died from an adverse reaction to the medication that she had been given. She went into complete psychosis, and at one point was running through the halls, banging on everyone's doors, begging for help, and telling us that the nurses were trying to kill her. I will never get those sounds out of my head. I had no idea what hellhounds were until I got home and searched. For what I had seen. I've let it lay dormant in my brain since then, but recently I've been having dreams where they show up, and it's terrifying. I'm so lost as to what to make of it, and terrified to make any assumptions. This happened when I was young, around 7 to 8 years old. I was napping in my room that I shared with my younger brothers. Our bedroom consisted of only 3 mattresses put on top of 2-inch wooden panels and a child-sized wardrobe. There was also a floor-to-ceiling window that was strictly for decoration and couldn't be opened. When I woke up from my nap, my babysitter, she was a live-in, was folding our clothes. I talked to her for a while, and then went out to get a water. I don't remember what, but I needed to talk to her after, so I went in again. But she wasn't there. I remember thinking that it was weird. There had been no sound of any closing or opening of doors in the 5 minutes when I had left the room to go get the water. I proceeded to ask every person in the house if they had seen her. None of them did. So I went inside the room for a second time, thinking maybe she somehow was just hiding for some reason. But I still couldn't find her. I went out again and searched the house, before eventually going back to the bedroom for a 3rd time, and there she was, sitting in the bed, folding clothes like nothing had happened. I asked her where did she go. She replied, and I quote, "What are you talking about? I was here the whole time. I was shouting at you and asking you why you kept going in and out of the room, but you didn't answer me." She thought that I was pulling a prank on her, and I got reprimanded. There are still a couple of other incidents that happened around her, and to this day, I can't explain it at all. My mother and 2 older brothers would visit my auntie and 3 cousins around Christmas. The whole family would get together too, uncles, aunties, you name it. Anyway, they lived up near Inverness, in Scotland, in a place called the Black Isle. It's actually in a place called Cromarty, but Inverness is more well known, so I'll say that. The Black Isle was said to be used back in the day as a place where witches would meet up on Halloween and perform rituals, animal sacrifices, that kind of thing. Whether or not that's true is something else entirely. I'll get on to the story now. We all rented out a holiday home just down the road from my cousin's house. It had multiple bedrooms in it, so it was perfect for a lot of guests. Me and one of my older brothers and his friend from Africa were all staying in one room. They were fast asleep. I, however, was not. I woke suddenly and didn't know why. I scanned the room with my bleary eyes. It was very dark, and I couldn't hear anything but the snores from my brother and his friend. The door to the room slowly opened with a creak, and I swear I froze with fear. I didn't see anything enter through it, but as I tried to scan my eyes around the room, I started to see shadow-like figures pulsating and hovering around the 2 adjacent beds, over my brother and his friend. There must have been at least 3 or 4 of these figures. The third one stood over my bed. Although this apparition didn't have any human-like features except maybe the shape of something human, I could still feel that it was staring right at me. I decided then the only course of action was to turn over and face the wall and go to sleep. The morning after, I described my experience to a few of my family members, and they joked that it might be the witches that performed those rituals in the past, and in general just didn't believe me. Except one person, my brother's girlfriend. She told me she had experienced something as well. She was only sleeping next door, and she said that she felt like someone had sat down on the end of her bed in the night, and said that she could feel the weight of someone on her legs, but nothing was there. Very frightened by this, I decided to read the guest book to see if anyone else had reported anything unusual, but nothing of the sort could be found. I'll never forget what I saw that night, and if you're ever up near the Black Isle or stay in the same holiday home I did, just be aware of strange figures entering your room at night.
Okay, so this has happened 2 times that we noticed. The first time was 3 months ago. At 2 a.m., my husband was playing an Xbox game. Name of the game was Halo. So it was only my husband. My kids were asleep upstairs, and I was down in the basement in our room in bed. I was reading. He told me that he was on the couch. The game was paused, since he was looking in his phone for a cheat or something for it. By the stairs, he clearly heard, "Mommy." My daughter doesn't call me like this. But they were asleep. He even checked. This was yesterday. At 5 p.m., I was coloring in the living room. The TV was on a Parking Wars episode, and my kids were upstairs playing a game. The hubby was outside mowing the yard. I clearly heard, "Mommy? Mommy, Mommy!" Clearly a little girl, and it sounded like it was behind me, not where my kids would be. And it was not my daughter's voice. Now today, I was folding clothes and had small hand towels by me. I watched as they were pushed off of the couch and away from me. Not like they would if they had just fallen down. "10 years ago, when I was about 16, I started babysitting for a family that lived in my neighborhood.
They had a sweet 7-month-old baby girl that I would babysit every now and then, and 2 dogs that were also very nice. Despite them having a nice house in a nice neighborhood, I still got a very weird feeling when I was in their home. It was almost like I was being watched or felt a presence there. Whenever I took care of the baby or their dogs, I would never want to spend longer there than needed. One night while babysitting her, about 2 years old, she asked to go down to their basement to play with Play-Doh. I said yes, and we went downstairs. I got a very weird feeling when we went down there, but I still got out the Play-Doh for her. We were playing for about 2 minutes before she came over to me and said that she was scared. I asked why she was scared, and she said that the man was scaring her. I said, "What?" Because I thought that I had heard her wrong the first time, and she said very clearly, "The man is scaring me." She then asked to go upstairs, and I said yes, and she bolted and ran up the stairs and left me to clean up the Play-Doh. About 6 months after that, the family asked me to care for the dogs while they were out of town, and I said yes. I ended up burning some sage and asking the spirit to leave the space. After that, I didn't feel the presence as strongly. It was to this day such a weird experience, and I still have no explanation for why that all happened. This memory still haunts me to this day. I was staying at an old hotel by the beach when I was around 8 or 9. It had a reputation for being an extremely haunted location around the eastern coast of Florida. The hotel I'm referring to is the Plaza, a 100-year-old hotel on the coastline. At one point, I went down to the lobby to get some utensils for room service. There was a clear door leading to the closed bar area. You were basically looking at the end of the serving counter when you peered in, with chairs on the side and a small beer keg at the end. It was very dark inside the room, and since the door was locked, I could only peek in through the glass. I inspected the room for about 10 seconds. Suddenly, I was looking at one of the chairs. It had a giant dent on the right rear leg. Then, suddenly, it flew backward and toppled over. I was so scared that I fell to the ground, and as soon as I landed, I heard what sounded like a woman screaming from the floor above, or possibly the second floor, as this was on the ground floor. It was quite possibly the strangest and most terrifying scream I have ever heard. It lasted about 4 seconds, and sounded like an old woman mixed with a lion, kind of. Again, this was around the time when I was 8 or 9, and seeing as how I am now 23, the memory has become slightly vague. I'm an actor at a haunted attraction in Pennsylvania. I was playing Jason on the hayride scene tonight. I hop up on the hayride and walk up and down the middle of it and scare people. This is my 2nd year doing it, and I absolutely love this gig. But tonight, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was the second to last wagon of the evening. I was in the middle of the wagon, headed toward the front, when I got a really bad gut feeling that something was off. I got chills immediately and tried to hide the feeling of terror I had at that moment from customers. I turned my head, and to my left I saw a girl staring at me. She looked completely normal at first, until she blinked. In what seemed like hours, I saw her blink in slow motion, her eyes going from the sides and meeting at the middle. After the first blink, I saw her eyes turn completely black. She cracked a small smile while staring at me straight through my mask and into my soul. I heard her laugh inside my head. I was frozen for a moment, and she blinked again, and she looked normal. My body unfroze, and I tried my best to finish the wagon. This was literally the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. What did I see? This just happened about 30 minutes ago. I was in the kitchen, and as I turned around, the very strong scent of my mom's distinct perfume hit me in the face. This happened 3 times. Now, my mother had an unusual mix of perfumes she used to wear, and was known to wear a lot of it. Also, she had a hint of air fresheners that she also had a lot of in her house. Mom passed away over 2 years ago and had never been to this house. We've only lived here 18 months. And we don't have anything here that smells the same as that. It was so strong and so distinct that my heart immediately pounded, and I shouted to my partner, "I can smell my mother." I thought I saw something climb the stairs earlier today too, but passed it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. Now, I think there may be more to it. I am currently sitting in my bed at 12:35 in my time zone right now and was watching a YouTube video a couple minutes ago. Without warning, I suddenly hear a scream. My first thought was that it was part of my video, but I checked, and it was not. It sounded like it was from a man experiencing pure terror and agony. It was a single scream from the worst fear and pain imaginable that lasted 2 to 3 seconds, and then silence. My dog started barking once I heard it. It was hard to explain, but it didn't sound like anything a human was capable of making. More like a much more convincing sound from a horror movie. I have heard some weird sounds around the house, mainly in the kitchen and dining room, since I moved in. I'm pretty skeptical about things like this usually, but that was like nothing I have ever heard before.